afternoon, everyone. Good to be here with you. I just enjoy coming out here and seeing old friends and new friends and young friends. I brought my Bible up today. My sermon today is going to be out of Acts 80. Those of you who know there's not that many chapters in the book of Acts. I don't know exactly how many there's going to be when Christ returns, but I think there's a lot of history between the first century AD and now that will be in the book. And today, Mr. Call asked me if I could do some of the history in the church. I never thought I'd be old enough to be a relic in the church, but I think I'm getting there. And so what I did is I brought a PowerPoint, so you'll probably be looking at the pictures up there on the screen, to give a bit of history. At ABC, I realized I started teaching there that most of the kids that are there weren't even alive when Mr. Armstrong died. And United and all the splinter groups out there that came from the knowledge that God gave him. And so to understand what's out there and to understand why we thought the way we did. And some of the questions that I get from young people especially is, why did we think the world was going to end back in the 70s or 80s? And also, why did Mr. Armstrong fly around the world and meet world leaders? Why did the church do what it did? And in looking at it from the people that are old enough and yet to be at least 40 years old to remember that now and have been in the church. But I always go to Haggai with the kids and read in Haggai 2:3 where it says, "Who's left among you that saw the house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes? In comparison, it's nothing." And that's how a lot of the older people see it, because at the time, I grew up in the church from the age of 2 on, and so I watched it happen. And I was always at one of the headquarters. I went to Imperial Schools, which was the church's grade and high school. At the time, I did 12 years of that, and then I went to Ambassador College on 2 different campuses, and I've been on all 3 of them, and watched that grow, watched the auditoriums being built, watched the buildings being built, watched the income grow. And so I saw everything, and it was huge. We owned our own camps then. We had all sorts of things. In fact, the income of the work when Mr. Armstrong died was about $150 million or more. It would have been equivalent of $1 billion today. And so we had a lot of things and a lot of people. We had 1,500 ministers in the U.S. and regional offices around the world. And we had an airplane, the G3, that cost as much as our annual income today. And people ask, well, why did you have that? What was the purpose? And et cetera. But again, we see it like, wow, we had all these things. We had 3 campuses. We had a campus in England, a campus in Texas, a campus in Pasadena. And we won the most beautiful campus award every year because it was beautiful. But part of the problem with that is we started looking at things more than people. And I think that's what God didn't intend for us in some ways, because when people came, we'd say, what are you about? Well, look at these beautiful campuses. Look at these young people. Look at these things. And really, it's not about things. It's about us. What do you do? Now you got to have somebody says, what are you about? Well, look at me. Look at the way I live. Look at what I do. That's what Christ said. Look at me. Follow me. So we should follow Christ and let people follow us in the same way. And so I get a lot of these questions. Also, I get questions because out on the internet there's all sorts of garbage, and part of the reason a lot of times people are kind of afraid to talk about Mr. Armstrong, because you look on the internet and you find all these things that are said that he never answered, most of which are totally untrue. Some have an element of truth, others don't. And so I've answered all those questions. So my first part is going to be this PowerPoint talking about why we thought that we did. And when I come back up, if you have any questions that you want to ask, you can ask them verbally or you can write them down and send them up. I never criticize anybody that asks questions. I find a lot of people want closure on things that they've heard. And so, and I've done that for people, and I've had a lot of people come to me and ask me questions. Well, I don't want to join the church. I just want to know, was it enough for the money? Did we do this? Was this true? And I explain it to them, why, and the good and the bad. I tell them exactly what happened. And it's funny, what I find is 3 or 4 years later, someone will come to me with a piece and say, I'm back in the church because of you. Why? Well, you answer my questions. Because a lot of people, there's a lot of garbage out there that people don't understand. So that and why we did what we did. And so since I was there, and again, at college on graduation day, I was supposed to go out in the field as a trainee to Salt Lake City, Utah. And on Friday of graduation, we had a formal brunch, and Mr. Armstrong, the phone rang, and they paged me, which never paged anybody during formal meetings. And I went up and, hello, do you know who this is? I said, well, yes, sir. I said, what do you want? He said, well, what are your plans? I said, I'm going to Salt Lake City on Sunday. He said, well, I want you to fly on my airplane. And I said, I'm supposed to leave Sunday. He says, they'll understand. And on Monday morning, 8 a.m., I took off on a 3-week trip with Mr. Armstrong. I actually served King Leopold on the second leg of that journey. I served Crown Prince Hassan in Jordan on that leg. We went over to saw Juan Carlos of Spain. I mean, it was a 3-week trip, supposedly. And almost all our trips were scheduled for 3 weeks, and they always last 6 to 8. 6 weeks later, I was in Paris, and I went to a restaurant. The restaurant was supposed to get married this weekend. And so I flew from Paris to New Jersey to get married. So, and that's how close I came to not being married. I mean, but so I was in the plane. I heard and saw everything that happened. I flew with him for 12 years. The first 7 I flew alone. My wife didn't fly. I was a steward and crew member. I did set up. I did embassy work, and I did all sorts of things. But my title was actually steward, chef, and everything on the plane was cooked from scratch. All the meals and things served on china. So I went on because in college I learned how to cook because I liked eating better than line food. And we had 15 men's clubs and 15 women's clubs, and we had a ladies' night and a men's night every semester. So you had 30 formal dinners a semester. And I was cook Chateaubriand and crepe Suzette and flaming cherries Jubilee and all these things. And the teachers in Texas, the 2 chefs there came from the School of Culinary Arts. So I just went and asked them, can I learn? Because again, with Imperial, I had all the Bible classes, I had all these things, and so I didn't really have to study. And so at night, I'd go into the kitchen and cook all these dinners, and like I said, I lived on Chateaubriand and Flaming Yan and whatever they had left over. And I made a lot of Caesar salad, made it from scratch. So I learned that, but then that's why I ended up on the plane. They asked Mr. Armstrong, the steward that was on before was quitting. Interesting, he didn't want to. They were doing church visits, and he didn't feel right flying on the Sabbath. Mr. Armstrong didn't challenge him. He said, if you feel that way, that's fine, and let him go. But when he asked for someone that could do it, I was there. He asked me about that, too. I said, Mr. Armstrong, we can fly to New York, you can speak to a church, you can fly home, and you actually get home before ministers have finished their church circuit. So to me, it's Levitical. I don't have a problem with that. And so he said, well, that's true, it is, but if you did, he never tried to judge anyone for conscience sake, so I appreciated that. So I ended up on the plane. That's how I ended up getting the job. And when I was on the plane, I ended up doing a lot of setup and meetings, all sorts of things that as a 21-year-old who had no knowledge of any of it, I had no idea what I was doing most of the time. But God does, and that's thankfully He does, otherwise we'd all be in trouble. And so this PowerPoint is kind of a bit of that. So the first 7 years I flew, and we were gone a lot. In fact, in 1975, I went through the airplane log. We were out of the country 312 days. And if my wife had been in Paris, she'd have seen more of me. But you didn't know that at the start of the year. The last 5 years, she flew with me. And when I became his aide and vice president, then she flew with us. And she was a stewardess and secretary. She'd work. You can see pictures of her there in the TV monitor of on the plane. And that's what I did, and that's what she did. And again, in the 1920s, that slide, you can read it. Mr. Armstrong was called, challenged on the Sabbath, tried to prove his wife was wrong. And you realize he was making, in the 1920s, he was making $18,000 a year, which at that time was what would be $1 million today. And when his wife challenged him, he saw that was he had to give up that because a lot of things happen on the Sabbath. And he said that the Bible teaches Sunday and not Sabbath. And so she said, does it? And so he set out a 3-year study to prove she was wrong. Ended up living going from $18,000 a year to $3 a week with a church. And the church got Seventh Day. And then before he started, and he went through 14 years of really abject poverty and then 14 years of relative poverty before the church really took off and grew. And so the background of what he did and why he did it. And he didn't start this to make money because he was making a lot of money in advertising, and gave that up for the church. And so again, since I spent 12 years with him, I spent a lot of time talking with him and all the things that he went through. A lot of it you can read in the autobiography, but there's other things that aren't. So anyway, he started flying, and that was kind of unusual how he did it till he realized God was doing a work. And so you can read the screens there. I can't read them from here. It's too far away from me. But I can just talk through them. So why did UCG come to be? What happened? Why did it splinter apart? What happened in 1995 where United had to start and another group split away? Why did the church apostatize? And why did the doctrines change? So all those history are pieces of there. And again, a lot of it was because of what people thought that the world was going to end, and it didn't end when they thought it was going to end. So a lot of people left. So I guess the button up here, I can change the slides. Right. I didn't expect anybody else to do that. If I hit the right button, it'll keep going. If I hit the wrong button. And just a couple things there. Again, he started meeting all these people. Up on the top right is President Marcos of the Philippines. Of course, a lot of you recognize Nancy Reagan in the middle. That's Prince Mikasa, the emperor's brother at the time. Now it's the current emperor's uncle who's there. And we met all these people and did all these things. And why? What was the purpose of it? A lot of people say he was out autograph hunting. He never asked for an autograph except one time. And that was we were visiting with Prime Minister Nakasone in Japan. And we always gave a plain truth to all the people we met and things. And he handed the plain truth to him, and he, before he gave it to me, he ripped it back, and he looks at, and Nakasone was on the cover. And he said, well, you're on the cover of this. So actually, that's the one time he signed the cover of the plain truth. That's the only autograph he ever asked for. But that was interesting. In fact, I have the copy of that at my house, so if you come visit, I'll show it to you. But so all these people, why did we do that, though? And it wasn't because he wanted the travel. It wasn't because he wanted to do all these things. It's just that he felt the church needed that. And why? Okay, Matthew 24:14. This gospel will be preached to the world as a witness, and then shall the end come. That, to him, was a commission. Because, obviously, we're waiting for the end. We're waiting for Christ to return. And the gospel's preaching to the world as a witness. And, but how could we think this was going to end 35-some years ago? Gone on. Were we stupid and superstitious, or were there a lot of factors that could easily be misinterpreted? And if so, what were they and why? So that's what I'm doing in this thing here, so you can see what it is. Again, finishing the work. And this is like I said, you can read that up there. I can't read it from here. I guess I could open my Bible and turn to them. But basically, we have the Church of the Revelation, and we have the Sardis era ahead of us, which we term the Church of God's Seventh Day. They don't like hearing that. In fact, I was at their convention this last week. They had it, and the president of Church of God's Seventh Day asked me to come. So I was over there, met and had dinner with him in the meeting, and he asked me a lot of questions about these things and what happened. In fact, he told me at the end, he said, you should write a book about all this stuff. Well, probably should, but I'm always hoping Christ would come first. But I'm getting old enough now that I better do it before I die. So again, and then the Church of Laodicea is hot and cold, and it doesn't do a whole lot. It's lukewarm. And then, of course, in the middle, we have the Philadelphia Church of God. And the Philadelphian church has the doors open to it. And so he thought that he should do it. So, again, he was challenged on the Sabbath. He went for years without anything. And then God started showing him that God was a family. He didn't believe that at first. He thought that was blasphemy to think that we could be part of the God family, that we must be angels, but he knew we weren't angels. And he knew that the scriptures all said Christ is our older brother, will be as he is, etc. And he saw the Bible's pretty clear that we're part of his family. And so that was it. And then again, it said that many things will be restored in the church. With Christ, Elijah will come and restore all things. And so since God showed him the feast days, which he kept by himself with his wife for several years before he figured out why. Just the Bible said to do it. And he started keeping that, and the work started growing. And again, the errors of the church, which I mentioned already. I'll jump that slide there, Philadelphia. But Philadelphia, between that, is the doors are open. No man can shut it. They can't be closed. And all these doors are opening for him later in life. And since you realize that those things have to be done before Christ returns, and if you believe that you're going to be there till Christ returns, then that means you got to do it. And so that's what he started doing. And again, Matthew 24 again, many will come in my name, saying I'm the Christ, and shall deceive many. And that happened. There'll be wars and rumors of wars, pestilence, famine. You're well aware of sermons on those things. And all those things seem to be happening at the time. And they're happening worse now, obviously. They've gotten a lot better. In 1984, I was in his house, and some Levites, they were priests actually, that came to the door, knocked on the door. There were 4 of them. They had the curls and the black hats and black garb, and so it's pretty easy to know who they were. And they wanted to see Mr. Armstrong. And so I asked Mr. Armstrong, do you want to see them? And he said, sure. So he came in, they talked to him. And they said they wanted him actually to help fund a temple they wanted to build. They already had all the temple accoutrements, the horns, the silver things. I mean, you can read all the things that they had. They had the red heifer, the garments. They were raising money to build that temple. And of course, the temple sacrifices will be stopped. The end time, tying those things together via the scriptures that we have is something that you couldn't deny. I mean, those things were going on. And so we're happening thing. Again, were these things happening? Were we close to the tribulation? With 6,000 years, we know that 7,000 years, the millennium is the 7,000 years. And we know that we were pretty close to 6,000 years through history. And so it must be happening. And so, again, be great tribulation and all those things. And unless those days are shortened, no flesh will be saved. So if you shorten 6,000 years, and you're already, obviously, if you do the begat chapters, and as a kid in Imperial, we always said Adam was sold, begat Seth, begat Enos, and we did it in 6,000 years. If you do the math, the 6,000 years actually came to 2012. But Christ didn't return in 2012, so obviously there's some things about the math that are wrong. But the key is, what I find in doing it and having done it so many times, when you talk about when they were born at the start of the year or the end of the year? Did they both get a year for it? There's certain times we know. Solomon said it was 430 years to the Exodus from his time. We know that. We know Abraham to the Exodus because of the promises there. But we don't know the days before the flood. We know the ages, and we also, some of the kings, you had the king reign so many long, and he begat this person. Well, did they both get the same number of years? So there's room for about 30 years or so, one way or the other. And if God's trying to hide something, he can make every, if you're flipping a coin, he can make it have heads all the time. So, and no one knows the day or the hour, so mathematically you're not going to be able to know exactly what it is. But at that time, adding up the math, 2012, and God cuts the day short, therefore he could be coming any time. So we interpret the scriptures the way we want to see them. Nobody I know doesn't want the kingdom to come. And so because of that, we see everything in the light of, hey, come on, let's get this job done. And there was an urgency in the church back then too, because we thought the end was coming right away. And if the end's coming right away, then, hey, get ready for it. And so the church was exciting. And we were building buildings, we were seeing all these things, we were growing. And so all this was happening. Again, 1960s and 70s, if you look at prophecy, we had the 6-day war in Israel. When you read in the Bible about the armies around Jerusalem and war and things like that. We had the Vietnam War, which we lost, so the pride of our power was broken, which is spoken of by the prophets, that would happen. The economy was in a major recession at that time, back in Jimmy Carter's era, and we were going downhill. The sea gates that was prophesied for the descendants of Israel to have, Britain, the pride of its empire. The sun never set on the British Empire, and the sun was setting rapidly on the empire at the time. They were losing the sea gates to other countries and things. That was happening. And so again, European Union. At that time, they didn't have the European Union per se, but they had the common market. So it looked like Europe was coming together. All the things that we saw in prophecy, which people have thought all along, in some ways, if you were in Europe during the Black Plague, when the death was there, you thought, wow, the end's here. And it was locally, pretty much. But never before had it been around the world at the time. And we also knew the two witnesses would come and that the whole world would see them. And at that time in the 70s, you'd see these satellite dishes. And Mr. Armstrong, those who were old enough then, we actually broadcast live around the world on the Feast of Tabernacles via satellite. And we thought, wow, the world can see things as they happen. And I visited some African villages and the grass huts, nothing there but the satellite dish and a TV. So even they could see it out in the middle of nowhere. And of course today we have cell phones and everybody can see everything anytime all around. So it's even more so now than it was then, but there was enough happening then to make us think that the end time was right there with us. And so that was some of the things that were happening, and it seemed like, wow, and plus Mr. Armstrong's getting older. We also had the 144,000 in Revelation 14:1. And the number of them are 144,000. They're the first fruits of the earth, and the church is the first fruits. And because the church got so large, we thought, well, even though the interpretation of the 144,000 in the early years of the church, when Mr. Armstrong went in 30s and 40s, his writings, there's Revelation 7, you're familiar with that, there's 144,000 there, 12,000 from Reuben, 12,000 from Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, et cetera, all the tribes. And then the innumerable multitude. Well, early years, that was Israel's countries, the nations going into the millennium, and the innumerable multitude was the other nations. When the church got big, it kind of got melded into the fact that the 140,000 was the church. And because the church was getting large. And so now the church, by the 80s, was 100, 110, 20, 130,000 or so. And it looked like, wow, we're almost there. It's time to go. So all these things are happening, and we're excited about it. And people that went to the feast then, I mean, you know, our feast days today were the size of our churches back then. And it was interesting. You know, we didn't even start a Bible study church, so it was about 300 people. And now we have very few churches with that many people scattered. Our feast sites are bigger than Joel Osteen's mega churches. And we had them all over the country for people who were there. You know, and so that was what was happening. So Christ must be coming really soon. This was a feast in 1933, 21 people. This is the big sandy metal building that was built, and I was in second grade when that was, or first grade finishing. I actually attended second grade in that building before we moved to Pasadena in the middle of the year. And at that time, there were 1,000 people maybe that were there at that time, 1960. And in 1986, 136,000 people keeping the feast. So we're getting close to 144,000, and we all want the kingdom to come. We want Christ to return. So it's easy when you want something real bad to, you know, if you've been young and you're thinking about getting married, it's, I want it, you know. and then you get it finally. And it's not the millennium, but it's wonderful. Okay. So the growth of the church, and you can't read those, so I can't read them either right there. But this, I have the emails in 1986, the statistics of the church, the attendance, how much the income was, how many stations we were on 476 TV stations we bought time on, plus cables, which covered all the cities around like that. We're the largest group out there. And of course, Mr. Armstrong pioneered radio and TV in those things. And so all these statistics that were there are fascinating. And you can get a copy of that. It's back on your computer, and you can read it yourself. There's no way I can read it from here, and I don't doubt you can read it from there either. If I have a big enough screen, you can read it pretty easily. But it talks about all the people who are baptized. We had put out 500 million, or 50 million USMBCs we had put out up to that time. And that was just one booklet. We were putting out, the last year's life, we were doing almost 9 million plain truths, and we had 10 issues a month, a year. So you're talking 90 million magazines being mailed out at that time. And again, this was a record for 9 months in 1986 of how much would happen and the size of the church and things listed there. And every year before the feast, we get a list of all these things to read, how much you know, $1 could do. It would pay for 2 magazines and do this, do that. It was encouraging to see all those things, but exciting to see the work grow and what it was. And again, the church was growing. We're almost at 144,000. Okay, this was another paper that was sent to us on the effect of a single average Holy Day offering in 1986, how much it would do. It listed the TV stations we could be on, the number of coworkers that were added to the list. And I think we had, by that time, it had, 50, 60 million people had called in on the watch lines. I mean, there's so much happening in a given year. We put out more in one year then than United has in its whole history. So it's, a big difference. But today, it's not by might or our power, it's by God's Spirit. And so the internet, we're doing a lot more. So we're doing a lot around the world through that wasn't available back then. Again, ways of the gospel reaches millions. It lists all the TV stations and things there. And again, I have copies of all that, but I just put them on the slide so that people can see why we thought, wow, the work is growing, the end's coming, and those of us who see today is so much smaller. And again, I can't read that, but they're all there. Again, over 50,000 members met in the regional churches. This is a listing of the churches. We came to Cincinnati for just a weekend from start to speak, and there were 6,000 people there that weekend. And so those are your lists. We had 4,000 and 5,000 people. This was just a regular Sabbath church visit. Oop, you okay? Earthquake. Christ is coming. So, but again, that was August 1981. And we had larger visits later on because the church was even growing. Again, by 1986, the Feast of Tabernacle attendance in the U.S. was 136,000 people. And again, these numbers and prophetic things that you kind of put in your mind and you hear them, and I heard them from the time I was 2 years old. And so, and I heard them in 3 and 4 hour sermons, so thankfully I won't go that long. And yeah, when your preacher can talk longer than the kid can sleep, that's too long. I know, I tried. Okay, so why did Herbert Armstrong meet with foreign leaders? Again, back to Matthew 24:14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. He had a vision, and you can read about that in his autobiography, and his wife, where an angel came down and wrapped their arms around and said that you're going to do a work, and he asked, is Christ coming? In the dream, he asked, is Christ coming? And the angel said, soon. And so soon to him, well, it must be going to happen in our lifetime. We got a work to do, and especially as we get closer to the end, the church was getting big and all these things were happening, and all of us thought he would be able till the end. I mean, Michelle and I never planned to have children because I'm flying. I didn't want to be an absentee father. I flew alone, and if she got pregnant when we were flying, then that'd be the end of that. And so we figured we'd never have kids. And so you're thinking those things and sacrificing for the millennium and for Christ's return and the kingdom to come, etc. But for him, being over the church, that meant that has to be fulfilled before he comes. And so therefore, I have to do it. Now again, there's a lot of groups out there, some of the groups that you have to believe he was the Elijah to come and things before you can be in their church. And I always ask people, I say, well, how long do you have to be dead before you're no longer the end time witness? And, and so it's been 36 years. And so I have no problem if that's what God had in mind. We interpreted the scriptures that way. And frankly, I tell people, if you're in an 8-lap race, Mr. Armstrong is 7 laps ahead of everybody else because we are putting out so many magazines, so many things, meeting so many leaders. If we interpret it right, then he's way ahead of anybody else. But then again, there are the 2 witnesses that come, and the gospel is going to be preached by them. And so there's other ways to interpret it. It's just kind of like in Revelation when it says, when you see the army, or Matthew, it says, you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, flee. Well, I've always thought, man, there's a war going to be going on, that's it, and you got to get out of there before it happens. And I look at it now and I think, okay, what if the UN puts a peacekeeping force around Jerusalem? Would that fit the prophecy? It'd be an army surrounding Jerusalem. Now, if you're at war and they're surrounding you and attacking you and you leave the city, what happens? You get killed. If there's a peacekeeping force, you could get out. So I mean, it's possible there's a war, or it's possible it's a peacekeeping force or something else. So we look at it from our perspective and interpret it that way. And so there's other ways. So he was interpreting that the same way that others have interpreted in the past, that then he thought, I have to do this. And so he started doing that. Again, was the gospel preached to the world? Were world conditions about to bring an end to the world? Was food production keeping up with population? Was the church approaching 144,000? Were 6,000 years about over? Those are the things that everybody's thinking excitedly that, wow, we're about to finish this thing. And if we had, then a lot of you wouldn't have been born. So you're glad we didn't. Okay. Time magazine and other magazines. The doomsday clock in the 60s has moved to 1 minute before midnight because we had the Cuban Missile Crisis and they're going to bomb us all. And kids like me were crawling under the desk with these air raid drills and things, which really wouldn't help you in an atomic bomb went off, but made you feel good, I guess, to practice. And so again, we had the Cold War at that time. Population was exploding. There were riots. I lived on Bellevue, right off Orange Grove Boulevard at the time of the Watts riots in the 60s, and they actually came along and torched our palm trees, and they went up like Roman candles with those dead fronds. That's why they started shaving them, because they caused fires. And there was all sorts of riots going on then. And again, the war in Israel was happening. Scientific charts, they were showing that food production was decreasing, and the population was increasing. So you got this cross in the thing. And Time Magazine is saying that we'll be starving by the end of the 60s. Okay, well, what happened, though? Well, some of the agricultural methods of fertilization produced more grain, and abortion shut down population growth quite a bit. But now we're back to the same point we were then. We're right now, especially with the war in Ukraine, about 40 or 50% of the world's grain is grown there, and it's not going to get out because the Russians are saying we'll blow up the ships. So we're close to the same situation now that we were then. But Time Magazine is saying, hey, we're going to be starving. All these things that we read in Matthew 24 are happening. And so we better get ready. And again, there were some large earthquakes along the Ring of Fire and other places at the time. A couple of them in Pasadena, even in California area where we were. And so, again, it was real easy to say, hey, these things are happening right now. And in 1967, Loma Armstrong died, and that was his pillar. The funny thing is, she did not like to travel. When they went to Europe, and they did a trip in Europe in the 50s, and they went on the Queen Mary and on bus and trains. And so, again, in 1968, Mr. Armstrong met King Leopold of Belgium. And I actually brought with me the envoy that someone gave him. And that started the travels abroad, really. And Mr. Armstrong wasn't even thinking this direction when it all happened, but then I'll tell you what happened with King Leopold is he had a foundation for the conservation of nature, and he did a lot, avid photographer. Had some beautiful pictures of the archer fish and all these different things. If you got the plain truth, back in the 60s, a lot of the paintings or the pictures that are in there were King Leopold's. Well, King Leopold had these pictures, and Mr. Schnee was over the German office with Mr. Hennig, who did the photography, developing things for the king. He happened to have those on his desk when Frank Schnee was there. He looked at these and said, wow, these would be great. The magazine had just gone full color. We're doing a series on evolution and creation, and we'd like to have some of these. And Hennig said, well, you can't have those. Those are the king's. He won't let you have those. Well, he happened to talk to King Leopold and mention it when he gave the photographs that someone would like these for their magazine. And he said, well, who? And Hennig said, well, it's Ambassador College, and he asked what it was, and Schnee took and gave him an envoy. And the king went through the envoy, and he says, wow, a character-building institution. I want to meet the man who would start a character-building institution, that everything's clean and they have rules and morals and values and things. Because again, the 60s was the time of the hippies, and morals were going out the roof. And so he asked to meet Mr. Armstrong. And so Mr. Armstrong went to meet King Leopold in 1968, and in Brussels in the palace, and they hit it off. He was about 8, 9 years younger than Mr. Armstrong, but they really had a good discussion. The king was very much into trying to preserve nature and things, and so Leopold was about to go down to Singapore and to Indonesia, which is where he was doing a lot of his photography work at the time. And so he asked Mr. Armstrong when to come. And so they flew together in the G2 to Singapore, and he met with Prime Minister Lee of Singapore. And then he went to Indonesia and met with President Suharto, who ruled Indonesia for some 20, 30 years. And at that point, Mr. Armstrong thought, is this how God is going to send the gospel to the world? Because he knew that Jonah was sent to Nineveh, and God sent prophets to that, and if you talk to the king, then the kingdom was warned, and so maybe that's how God wants this done. And so at that point, then he started meeting other people. And they opened up. Again, things all seemed to be poised toward the end. Everything was happening, you know. The church, the world conditions, I mean, almost everything you can lay out there was coming at that time. And so all of us in the church that have been reading these prophecies for decades and watching all this happen thought, hey, the end is near. And again, it was real easy to be excited and be ready for it. And the urgency that Mr. Armstrong always tried to instill in all of us to be spiritually ready, because Christ is going to come. And he's going to come as a thief in the night. And so we're watching world conditions. We're seeing all these things happening. The gospel is being preached around the world in all these places. In the 70s, we had 3 nights in Kenya. The head of Kenya introduced Mr. Armstrong. We had, I think, 13,000 people one night, 15,000 other, and 17,000 the other night. And again, his gospel message was actually printed in about 5 or 6 different languages, and it even crossed borders, because the British borders for the countries were not where the tribal borders were. And all of it was translated and put in the paper. So it was being spread around. In the Philippines, we were there for 2 or 3 nights, and again, 10, 12, 13,000 people at those things. A lot of things were really happening, exciting. And in 1977, Mr. Armstrong had a heart attack. And he basically died. They resuscitated him, CPR, brought him back to life. And he didn't, he thought it was over. Everybody did think it was over. And so again, why was he brought back to life? What purpose was there in that? And so I was going down to Tucson back and forth to see him. I actually flew with Ted Armstrong during that time for a bit before he left the church. And so I saw the things that were happening, and Mr. Armstrong was there, and Mr. Armstrong, when he came back, he asked the doctor, will I ever be able to write again? I need to be able to write, because he wrote all the booklets for the church and all the things that, the early history. And the doctor would tell him, be encouraging, oh yes, you'll be able to write, you'll be able to do that. And he'd turn around, look back at us and say, he'll never write again. He's going to die. And the people believe the doctor. Well, then he started getting, about 3 months later, he's writing articles and typing. And we're down there, and he asked the doctor, well, will I ever be able to fly again and travel? Oh yes, Mr. Armstrong, you'll be able to travel. He'll never travel again. He's going to die. And a lot of the department heads that were going down, so like that, believed he was going to die and started making their little empires. Because, hey, when he goes, how are we going to divide this thing up? And the money was good, and et cetera, and what's going to happen to the work, and who's here, and a lot of unconverted attitudes at the time. But then in 1979, November, he takes a trip. We go to China and meet with Deng Xiaoping, the successor of Mao Zedong, and met with him. And so all these things are happening, but all these people made their positions known. And so, and Mr. Armstrong told me, he said, I don't need to travel. He says, I don't enjoy life anymore. And he was right. He said, food doesn't taste the same. I always told people that were cooking for him, you'll never be as good as the last person, because he couldn't taste, unless he dumped a lot of salt on it, you couldn't even taste it. And his taste buds were gone. He was legally blind. He got tax credits for being legally blind. He couldn't hear very well, so he got hearing aids, finally. And so he's doing the work, under all sorts of handicaps. And he said, I'm only here because God has something for me to do. So again, that made us all think, wow, it's the end. And besides, at that time, he's 80-some years old. And so therefore, the world's got to end pretty soon. And so here, the excitement again going on. And so he put the church back on track. 79, the very things that happened in the 90s were happening in the 70s at the college. I came home from a trip. My wife said, hey, do you realize somebody at the church said that Christ really wasn't in the grave 3 days and 3 nights? I said, oh, Michelle, you heard it wrong. Because Michelle had no background. She came to college expecting to go home for Christmas, so she didn't know anything. And so I thought she just got it wrong, but it turned out, no, people were saying stuff like that. And so Mr. Armstrong was brought back and put the church back on track. He got rid of the heresies that were coming and all these things like that. It was kind of a prep thing for the rest of us to get ready for what's going to happen, another 10 years. And so he puts everything back on track. He starts traveling again. He starts meeting world leaders. Everything's growing again. The income is growing 10 and 12% a year. When you have a $100 million income, you're growing 12% a year. That's $12 million. And it was growing rapidly when he came back. And again, the excitement that everybody had at the feast. And again, he broadcast around the world on the holy days for everybody to see at that time. So the gospel, everything's rejuvenated again. It was kind of a letdown when he had the heart attack, but he didn't die, and he comes back. Wow, time to go on. So here we are. Again, doors are open globally. All the things, preaching the gospel more than ever before. When he came back in 79, the budget for TV was about $3 million. The first year back, it went up to 21 million, then 24 million, and it was 27 million the last 3 years before he died. And so we're really powerfully doing that. We're going meeting countries. In the 80s, we saw more countries in the 80s in any given year than we did in the whole decade of the 70s. And so all these things are happening, and the church is excited. Here's a bunch of the magazines that are there. 1980-some feast there, biggest one on earth. Again, HWA is meeting world leaders. I usually read them off the slides, but I can't read off the slides today, but they're there. So again, he meets officials in Europe, in the Middle East. That was one. This is only from 1982 on. I didn't even go back before that. And he started traveling in the late 60s, early 70s. And so again, here he goes to Bangkok, and he meets with in Hong Kong, and go to Bangladesh that year as well. Different places we went. And again, writing these articles, I wrote most of the articles. I took most of the pictures too, so I'm not in any of them. That was always nice because I didn't want people to know what I looked like. And then Mr. Armstrong again speaks over from Europe, talks there. Here's he's meeting with Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan, and he met with King Hussein a number of times. He tried to do a lot of things in the Middle East over there. Of course, we had the dig for the students from the 60s through the 84 and 5. That's Bernard Brain, a member of British Parliament that he was at. There he's meeting with Prince Charles in England. We met with Prince Charles, now King Charles, half a dozen times. We actually spent a whole day with Prince Charles and Princess Diana at the Rothschild estate with the Rothschild brothers. And a fascinating story, another story I'll tell another time. But interesting to be there with that. This is planting the tree to start the university in Kenya. When Kenyatta was alive, it's interesting, Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first president of Kenya, Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, who traced his lineage back to Queen of Sheba, supposedly, and Mr. Armstrong were all born in 1892, same year, so they're all good friends. Mr. Armstrong donated $20,000 and Kenyatta gave 500 acres to start a school of agriculture similar to what we did in Thailand. We're going to build little portable buildings, have people come in, teach them how to grow plants and do things. And we did that very successfully in Thailand, and they wanted it in Kenya, so the two of them started that. Well, what happened was the Japanese government, and Mr. Armstrong had about 10 Diet members who considered themselves his Japanese sons. They weren't in the church, but they really liked him. And they went in, and after they did that, they thought it was a good project, a good cause, and so they put in $29 million and built the Jomo Kenyatta College of Agriculture and Technology. When the buildings were done, they came back in and put $20 million, stocked the library, stocked all the tractors and equipment, and scholarshiped anyone who had 500 acres or more that one of their children or a foreman could go for 4 years to the school. And the Japanese, when I went there about 8 years ago, I went to Kenya with John Elliott and Monty Knutson. He wanted me to go to talk to the church. I also had to check our properties there because a lot of them were stolen by Congo. We wanted to check and see, make sure we had good title. Because Kenya at that time was the only African country other than South Africa that had fully laid out all the surveys of the land. And so I'm there, and the first day they gave me to rest, and I said, I don't need to rest, I'm going to go see the Minister of Interior. So I went and saw him, and up on the wall was a picture of the president, which they always have in the offices, and I didn't know who the president was. It had been 30-some years since I'd been there. And it was Uhuru Kenyatta. It was Kenyatta's son, who was about my age. And they'd cornered Michelle when we were at their estate. After Mr. Armstrong was there, Mrs. Kenyatta asked us all to be there, and the whole family, all 80-some members of the family, were there, and they cornered Michelle to ask her questions because they figured I knew the answers. They wanted to see if she did. And after about 10 minutes, I saw her trapped in the corner. I went and rescued her. But the thing is he was president. And so the Minister of Interior said, I said, oh, I know you, Herbert. I said, we're friends. And he said, oh, really? He said, well, do you want to see him again? And I said, well, I don't have time on this trip. He said, well, if you come back, I'll put you in contact. You can go meet him again, which I didn't necessarily need to, but if it was needed, I could do it. Well, then we went to the school that Mr. Armstrong started, and 10 years after it started, it became a university. And so now it's the university, Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. And that year that I was there with Monty, they were having their 25th anniversary of the school, and the president was on the stage, and 40,000 people. Well, I'm a week after this, I'm there at the college, and they said, why do you want to see it? And I said, well, I was here when it was founded. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, Mr. Armstrong and Kenyatta, when they started this thing, I was on the plane, I was there. And I actually took the Ambassador for World Peace book that we had and had pictures of him. Those pictures were in the booklet. So they knew I wasn't lying about the thing. And they said, well, they asked me, they said, on the wall, there's a plaque about the university. On the right side, all these Japanese Diet members. On the left side, there's shadow places where photos were. Those were photos of Mr. Armstrong doing it. Takachi, when he went there, had him take down all the photos of Mr. Armstrong. Did the same in Jordan and the same other places in the world. And so the school was asking me, well, what were the other pictures and why did they give all this money to Kenya? And so I explained to him how Mr. Armstrong started with Kenyatta, and the Japanese Diet members liked him, and they wanted to help, and anything Mr. Armstrong did that they felt was really good, they'd take back to the Diet and try to expand it. And they did. We raised a lot of millions of dollars from the Japanese for some of these things that people didn't know, because they respected him so much. And so I explained that Mr. Armstrong believed in character and the things, and we wouldn't do projects that promoted war, but we would help people to grow food. We'd help people to dig wells. We'd do all these things that we did. And so I did that, and they said, you should have been here last week. You'd have been on stage with the president telling us our history. And they said, if you come back, we'll pull the student body together and have you tell them how the school started. So, I mean, things that happened 30, 40 years ago are still remembered, and people wonder about those things. And so that was the university starting there in Kenya. Here's Mr. Armstrong again with Prince Charles at that time again. and he met with King Hussein on that trip. Again, I just run through these month at a time. The covers, this is what the church was seeing every month when the worldwide news would come out. And here he is with King Hussein and Judge Singh of the World Court and Prime Minister Ladas of Cyprus in that. Again, I'm just going off of memory now because I can't read those things like I normally do on the big screen. But that's okay. It's there. There he's again meeting with the Supreme Patriarch of Buddhism. The Supreme Patriarch it was interesting what he said up to Mr. Armstrong at one time. He was talking to other people like that, and he said, if only people did what Mr. Armstrong said, we'd have world peace. Mr. Armstrong is for the world what Buddhism is for Thailand. And he recognized, but he said, if you could only teach it. And our projects were designed for people to see our students and realize that you can teach this, and you can do it. So that's what that was there. That's the ambassador meeting with the head of Governor General of Bermuda, I think it is. There we're meeting overseas again. I can't tell that one exactly what that one is. I think it's Mr. Armstrong meeting Constantine Papadopoulos from Greece, I believe. That's King Juan Carlos of Spain he met with. And then this is some of the medals and things he was given from Thailand. Down the bottom, I think is Prima Dasa, of Sri Lanka. Again, just a lot of people, all these different people were meeting on the thing. He met with the Rotary. He was asked to speak at the Rotary in Athens. And the Athens Rotary, that's, Nakasone there. But the Athens Rotary, the one he spoke to there was the billionaire Rotary at the time. That's where Onassis was. All the magnates of Europe were on that Rotary. And so they asked Mr. Armstrong to come speak to it. And about a half an hour before we're there to speak, the president of the Rotary calls me up and says, oh, I need to tell you, by the way, we have a rule in our Rotary, we do not talk religion. Religion has caused lots of problems over here, so we do not talk religion. What is Mr. Armstrong going to talk about? And I thought for a second, and I said, world peace. Pageant answer. So he goes there, and he gives one of the most powerful religious speeches he'd given. He talked about the Pope and some of the things I've seen there go great. And the president, as soon as he was done, the president comes running up to me. I thought, man, he's going to cut my head off. And he says, wow, that was interesting. We need to change our rules. I'm still alive. So, and that happened a number of places. You never knew what he was going to do. If it was going to be a real soft gospel message or a hard-on, what it was going to be. God kind of moved him in different ways to do whatever it was that he did. Again, this is Prime Minister Nakasone. That's actually Mr. Armstrong giving that plain truth that he signed in the meeting. And I took a picture of that. Again, Crown Prince Hassan of Jordan, and also we're going on Jordanian TV. Dr. Kamal was the head of the Broadcasting Association. Mr. Armstrong made some special programs for Jordan to air. So now we're sending out programs to the Arab world as well. Again, this gospel you preach to the world as a witness. With it, we go from there. That's Althorpe, Lord Spencer, Princess Diana's father. I met with him. I think that's von Habsburg. Did I skip a slide? Yeah, no, I didn't. Otto von Habsburg is there. He met with him in Europe, in Brussels, in Belgium. His two sons are real big in putting Europe together. He's the heir to he's the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's the heir to that as such. He renounced it. His children didn't, so his sons could still take that throne. There's a lot of speculation at the time. Here again, that's one of the British parliamentarians, I believe. There's also the Danish House. That's King Birendra of Nepal. He had met with King Mahendra, his father, much earlier on. King Mahendra was there, and Queen Aishwarya, we met with them, and they actually had our project in there. For our young people, it's interesting, we started the project there because they were friends of the King and Queen of Thailand. And the King and Queen had told them about what Mr. Armstrong had done to stop the opium growing in Thailand and all the things that we had done over there, and they wanted Mr. Armstrong to do the same thing in Nepal. And so we were asked to come into Nepal, and we started a project there and sent 3 or 4 students to start the project. And they had a walled-in several acres of land, but you had to go through the one gate in our project. They had to go through our project to get to all the other things. And after the first year, they were so impressed with our students that when I went and saw the Queen the following year, she asked me, said, can your students run $91 million, our foreign aid budget from the other countries? There are Daniels still around today. And that's why I tell young people, don't think that you can't do it when you're young. We got asked to do a lot of things around the world that were just shocking. I mean, $91 million, you got these 20, 21-year-olds being asked to do this. That's a special gift and things. And you understand how Daniel worked in Babylon and Mordecai and other people. You know, if God's going to do something, he does it. And so don't think because you're young that there aren't things that can happen that you can do. God does all sorts of things with that. That's meeting with the King and Queen of Thailand. They have 4 palaces. I've been to 3 of them to see them, and that was the one. Actually, in that meeting, we actually met the Prince Virulongkorn, who is now the king as well. He's the same age as I am. It was funny when I'm traveling with Queen Sirikit in Pasadena. We're traveling around, and her son was having a lot of problems at that time. This was, of course, 30 years before. And she asked me when we were traveling around, how do I make my son be a good king? It wasn't rhetorical either. She was asking, and I told her, I said, you need to raise your son the way you were raised. And again, her history, I can tell you that too. A lot of history between her and the king were not supposed to be the king and queen. He's the younger son. He's not the older brother. And his older brother was murdered because he was trying to clean up the thing, and he became king. So anyway, long story with that. But the funny thing, she asked me how to raise her son, and her son's a month older than I am. But so unique thing. We met a lot of the prime ministers. This is in Pasadena there. That's the mayor of Los Angeles and one of the I think senators from California at that time. Is Mr. Armstrong meeting with I think it's Thailand. And again, this was the Yamaguchi, not there was a congressman Yamaguchi. This is the businessman Yamaguchi. He had 10,000 or more employees, and he asked Mr. Armstrong if he could print the 7 Laws of Success in Japanese. And that's what that booklet is, to pass out to all of his employees that he gave them. And that's Mr. Armstrong. Jahan Sadat, wife of Sadat, who tried to make peace in Israel, was assassinated for it. Mr. Armstrong had told her, if you ever come to California, to come and you can stay with me. And she showed up and called him from Los Angeles, said, I'm here. So he invites her over, and that night was not to be much observed. And so Michelle and I are having 16 people to our house to have it at home for once with our families and some friends. And at 6 o'clock, Mr. Armstrong called and said, hey, I don't know what to do. John Sadat's here. You and your wife need to come over. So I left the key on the mat and note in the door, and all our friends came, had night rooms reserved, and we went and had it with him. So I'm a great host. I may not be there when you're there, but that's what happens. So we spent the evening, and it was funny, we spent the evening talking about Moses, the Exodus, the Egyptians. You're talking to the Queen of Egypt there with it. And she was, of course, familiar with the story. It was kind of an interesting night to observe, probably my list of highlights of odd things that happened. But that was one of them. There, Queen Sirikit, when she came to visit Pasadena, one of the major guests, when she came, the State Department had to come and approve the campus for her visit. And after that, we were an approved facility. That's why Nancy Reagan and other people were able to come to the campus later on, because she broke the ice for us by coming there, and the State Department wouldn't let her do it until they approved all of the buildings and all the things that she was going to be at in that thing. Again, that's her visit. We had all these functions in the auditorium. All those people are invited. There are people out there that say Mr. Armstrong bought his meetings and things, and I'll say the man, Stan Rader, who was a lawyer at the time traveling with him, did pay for some meetings. I know because someone came up to me and asked for the money that he hadn't paid them. I said, we don't do that. And so, in fact, Mr. Armstrong was really upset because he didn't know any of that was happening. And he made me promise I'd never pay for a meeting, and I never did for any of the ones I had set up before or afterwards. But he learned a lot of things that happened that he didn't know about, that I had to tell him when I was his aide. And that's what got me fired a few times, but he didn't want to hear it. He'd rehire me because he couldn't do anything since he was blind and deaf, and he needed me. So that was one of the things. But her visit was really special. And again, Mr. Armstrong couldn't walk around with her, so I had to take her all over the place during the time she was there. But again, a special time. That's Michelle. Michelle's dressed up in the royal Thai garb. We thought to honor her, she had some dresses made out of the Thai silks she'd been given by them. And so when she came, the Queen was late. Well, Michelle shows up there, and they heard the Queen was young and beautiful, and so all the journalists were taking pictures of my wife because they thought she was the Queen. And then the Queen showed up 10 minutes later, and they all moved. But so my wife almost made the newspapers, but one of those things that happens. Again, Mr. Armstrong meeting, I can't tell who that was, Chinese officials in China. We met a whole bunch of people in China. We had so many people there. One of the dinners we held, there were 76 ambassadors and 400 people from their government at the dinner. And unfortunately, he had to pay in cash, so I had to go to the bank and get money, because they charge Western rates. When they did a banquet, they charged their rates, 10 cents a person. When we were there, they were charging, $20 or whatever. So I had to go to the bank, and the biggest bill they have is about $3. So I had a suitcase. I feel like a drug dealer. But, carrying to pay for this banquet. But we met with all of Mr. Armstrong. Again, there were several TV broadcasts he did out of those meetings that were on the air, on TV, that he did. And one of the visits happened at that time, too, to say like how some of the visits came about. I was sitting at a table, and all of us were hosting tables. We had a slug of tables, and I had to host 2 tables, actually. There weren't enough of us to go around. And they were all doing gambé with muay, which is really strong. It's like white lightning. And but I had the Zambian ambassador at my table, and he's sitting there telling me how he was raised by missionaries, and the missionaries weren't that good. They were out playing with women. They were doing a lot of bad stuff. And so he was chewing us out. Mr. Armstrong's over at church, isn't he? And I'm getting this 3rd degree. Well, finally, the dinner came, thankfully, and we ate, and then Mr. Armstrong got to speak, and he speaks and gave a really strong message. And the Zambian ambassador, as soon as he was done, he kind of leans on the table and he looks at that man. That's what my country needs. Would you invite him? I'm going, sure. So again, there are things that happen that you didn't know how they were going to happen or what or why. But like I said, the people out there that think things were done differently than they actually weren't there and didn't see it. That picture there, I can't believe where that was. Was it South America or Europe? I think it's Europe. That might be Queen Noor. I'll tell you that. No, not yet. Where is that? This is Syria and Jordan. Mr. Armstrong, we went to Syria. He's the only private citizen up to that time, and I don't know if they've done it since, that had a dinner given to him by a cabinet position in their cabinet, and for that, which is really unusual and not usually done. Again, another picture, Mr. Armstrong meeting with, that might be, not sure if that's the Prime Minister of Israel, who that is from the picture. I can't see it from here exactly. Again, we met people all over the place. That's Abu Odi there. He was the assistant of the King Hussein. He came to Mr. Armstrong's house and to visit, stay with him again. And it was Ramadan during that time. And so I asked him, I said, we're going to have dinner tonight. I said, we'll go ahead and do it after sunset so you can eat. Oh, no, don't. You can go ahead and have it 7 to 6 o'clock. It's not a problem. I said, well, it's Ramadan. You can't eat then. And that's when I learned that almost every religion has ways you can pay for your own sins. And I said, well, here's Ramadan, you can't eat. He said, oh, no, all we have to do is give 2 meals to the poor for each one we eat. So if you're rich enough, you can just go and eat and just give meals away. I mean, so again, in God's rule, sin is a sin, you have to repent, period. There's no way to buy your way out of it. But other religions can all buy your way out of stuff. So I learned that at that time from him. And again, unique experience. And Mr. Armstrong again. Let me see if I can figure out where that one is on the listing here. Kind of got ahead of myself with some of the people. Again, just so many different leaders. And again, this is a list here, and again, you can't read it from there. This is a list of the dignitaries we met. It lists the kings, it lists the prime ministers, it lists some of the senators and things, it lists a lot of the mayors and governors, it lists just who they are, and where we met them, what their positions were. Again, we made a copy. I got 3-inch 3-ring binders with all this stuff in it. That's why I copied all this stuff. I stole it out of Pasadena when I left because I knew they were going to destroy everything, which they did. So I have more archives in my home than most people have it in their places. So those are all things that happen. And again, and again, I quit doing some of the lower level officials because the list got so long. So I basically stuck with just ambassadors and world leaders and things that he met. But again, interesting list of people. And again, on HWA's final overseas trip, we visited 9 countries in 24 days. 92 years old, legally blind, barely hear, and we finished his last book, Mystery of the Ages, in May of 1985. Again, was the end about here? Yeah, he's got to be coming pretty soon. He can't hear, he can't see. We're meeting all these people and things, and he dies. And a lot of people in the church thought, oh, we must have been wrong. This whole thing must be wrong. So a lot of people left when he died. Then Mr. Gotch came along, and he changed the doctrines, and a bunch more people died. Then the heresy came in, the apostasy, and it was sad. And look at that. We were always in the gun lap. All those things led us to be on the gun lap. And we were all let down because we were looking at a man and things and not God. And that's what God wanted. And plus God, when he's talking to Abraham, what did he say at the end? Now I know. Hey, he'd already left Ur of the Chaldees. He'd already waited 25 years for a kid. He'd already messed up with Hagar, and every time you try doing something on your own, you produce an Ishmael. And then finally he's about to kill Isaac, and God said, okay, now I know. And so God wanted to know with each of us in the church where we were. Mr. Armstrong, he held my hand. He says, promise me you'll help prepare the bride. I said, how do I do that? Go back to 4-hour church services and twice a day at the feast. And even in Texas and Big Sandy, we had unleavened bread 2 services a day in the late 50s, early 60s. And he said, I don't know, but he said in a few short years that the church will quit keeping the Sabbath. I said, how did they quit keeping the Sabbath? Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, it doesn't change. He said, it's going to happen. And he said the church will exist, but he said the foundation will close, the college will close. And I said, well, how does that? It doesn't say that in Scripture. He says, yeah, prophecy, it's going to happen. All that happened. And the thing is, it had to come from the pulpit. When Mr. Koch took over and said, you don't have to keep the Sabbath. Oh. All the people who believed what they believed because of this book, because of Jesus Christ, stayed with it. People who did it because they're following a man, it was wonderful. We had all these classes, clubs, we had the youth programs, we had the camps, we had the college, we had all this stuff. They said, oh, it's over, I don't have to do this anymore. And so, from the pulpit, you were offered, quit going to church, follow the heresy, start your own church, follow somebody else, anything you want. God knows whether you chose Christ as your king or not. And I think that was the whole purpose of what God did at that time, was to prepare the bride. And I think that's what's been going on ever since he died. God has been shaking the church and showing whether people believe that Christ is the head of the church or whether they're the head of the church or somebody else, or whether you have to go to church, or is it even real? And again, when you look at men versus God and his truth, that's what happens to you. And it's sad. But the unfortunate thing is because it wasn't exciting anymore, complacency sets in. The sense of urgency isn't near what it was back when I was younger. And I try to get people to have that sense of urgency and to remember what happened. When Jesus died, what did they say? That's John 21 up there, and I paraphrase it there. It said, this saying went out that John would be alive to the end, but Christ didn't say John would be alive to the end. All he says is, if I tarry, if you tarry till I come, what is that to you? But they thought that, church thought that the apostles would be alive. Christ's going to return because the Spirit was sent. And what does Joel 2 says? The Spirit's going to come, and after that, the end. Well, there's a lot of time between those 2 verses there. But they thought it was coming, and so they weren't there. They're staying in Jerusalem, staying there together because we're waiting for Christ to come. So persecution set in, and they got scattered because they had to go out to the world. And so John wasn't alive till Christ returned. I always thought, how could they be 2,000 years off? Well, at least we're only 35 years off so far. And then you also had the Apostle Paul. Were we wrong? Apostle Paul. Peter, that's the same scripture there. But Paul's writing, again, that's the one. Those of us who are alive and remain will rise to meet him in the air. Well, he wasn't one of the us's. He's one of those who dead in Christ rise first. And so they thought, and for some reason it seems like God gives us that ability when he picks leaders to think they'll be here till Christ returns, to be stimulated, to have a sense of urgency. And so that's what was happening with the church at that time. Again, were we right or wrong? Well, the prophecies are still going to happen. The Scripture's right, whether that happens or not. My stepfather gave me some good advice when I went on the plane. He says, you're going to see and hear a lot of things. And a lot of things won't be right necessarily. And he says, separate salvation from people. He says, if you were there when Abraham lied about his wife, I don't want any of that. If you're there when David was killing Uriah and sleeping with Bathsheba, I don't want any of that. If you're there when Peter denied Christ, I don't want any of that. But it's not about people. People make mistakes. Christ is the only one that didn't. And so don't let that happen. And so, yeah, Christ is going to come. All the things that we said are going to happen. It's just they weren't happening then. We thought they were, and because we want the kingdom to go, we want the land, that we want these things to happen. But now we're 35 years down the road. How much more time is there? I don't know. When you look at what's happening in the world right now, The governments, the plagues, the volcanoes erupting, the currency, the Bitcoin. There's going to be the currency is going to be something that the world will control. No man can buy and sell. You can turn it off in a minute. You can keep people. I was watching some of the one of the off channels. I was watching the things where they were talking to Kennedy, Robert Kennedy running, and all the things he was saying about censorship, and not one of it was on the news. They'd basically, even in the meetings there or something, they can shut us up. They can censor us. It says there'll be a famine of the word. There'll be a great falling away. I mean, is that the church? There's been a lot of falling away from the church over the years. I don't know, but those things are happening and will happen, and God knows He's in control of when those things happen. But I don't think it's very long. Again, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a great falling away. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Is that a falling away? How can you fall away unless you have the truth? We've had thousands of people leave the church. Again, what does God mean by that? Different ways to interpret it. Scripture is true. How we interpret it may not be. I always talk to people and they have a different point of view, and I say, well, you can be right, I can be right, we both can be wrong. We can't both be right. And so you keep studying it. That's where we go with that. Those things are happening. There's the Council of Elders, 1982. You can see them there. All of them are dead except myself and Mr. Helge and my wife, his wife. Half of them went apostatized. These are evangelists in the church. People that have been trained, been to Bachelor College and things. And they gave it up. You can't fall away. You can lose out on what God offers in that. I was 25 years younger than the next one up, and Mr. Armstrong. But like I said, to be in the meetings, to be in the room, to know exactly what happened, and to see the men, and why God appointed Mr. Koch, because He wanted us to go through these things. He knows what's happened. I'm sure in the temple in Jerusalem, we have the temple, they're not going to take the Jerusalem, and they destroyed it and burned it down. So things are not it, even if it's God's temple. Again, if you believe the scriptures, what you're told, this is the one where they defrocked me. And they said, you can no longer be an elder, because I told them I couldn't go to church because I might actually say something I believed, which would be very different than what they were teaching. I was causing division. So all the people that weren't allowed to go to the other churches came to my house. We had church at my house for a while, the last couple of years. They could not fire me at the college because Mr. Koch, when Mr. Armstrong died, I got removed from the council, removed from being his aide, removed from the vice presidency, and ended up at the college, which was where I wanted to have a family. I did have my 2 kids and moved to Texas with the college. And so I was there, but I did a business degree. And because of their accreditation, they couldn't fire me for my religion. All the other theology faculty were kicked out if they believed the truth. So I was there as a business faculty, so religion was my opinion, business is my degree, and so therefore they could not fire me. So I had all the students to my house, and I told them all the things that were going on with the church. I had all the pictures on the wall. I got a museum room in my house that has all the pictures and things that of people we met, various things. So I could explain to the students what it was. And all the students who hung on to the truth, I could help them. And so I didn't join United when it started in 95 because I got asked to, but I said, hey, I'm the only one that can help the students here at college. And a lot of parents calling me saying, hey, please don't leave. We need to have somebody. In fact, Dr. Hay called me and said, we need at least one converted person in the college. And I thought that was kind of cute. But it was an interesting time, to say the least. But they said I could no longer serve there, which I was irritated. I had a 3-hour conference with him, which means I chewed him out the whole time, told him he was wrong. And he got mad at me and finally said, well, you can say these things. Mr. Koch is dead, Mr. Armstrong, dead. And I said, well, you want me to show the police records? Because some of the people, there are things that happened with people in the church that left us that really, I think, were probably never converted, that were wrong. And I never used any of the things I knew to hurt anybody. They used everything they knew about people to try to blackmail them or whatever. That's not Christianity. And they were supposed to be the new Christians who were better than the old Christians. Us old covenant Christians, which were not old covenant. That's not true at all. But the thing is these people, Mr. Koch came to a meeting there, faculty meeting, and somebody said, why are you letting your staff make all these changes? And he said, no, I'm not. I didn't believe this in the 70s. And I was there, keeping my promise to tell Mr. Koch when he's wrong, which Mr. Armstrong made me do. And I raised my hand and said, Mr. Koch, you told Mr. Armstrong you believed all the doctrines. Now you're saying you didn't in the 70s. Are you lying today or are you lying to him? Meeting over. Because Mr. Armstrong made me promise that to him. He says, promise me you'll tell him when he's wrong. Because he made me pastor general. I was pastor general for half an hour to an hour. And I was smart, because I talked him out of it. But no, the thing is he came downstairs and he says, Aaron, you're the pastor general. I said, did God tell you that? He said, no. I said, why are you trying to kill me? And he says, what do you mean? And I told him, I said, look at the people in the Bible, you don't want this unless God wants it. If God told you, I'd do it. God would help me, but he didn't. I could have talked about Josiah and Joash and David and Christ. I was 33 at the time. But I knew if God doesn't want you to have it, you don't want it. And if he does want you, if you wanted me, I could never talk him out of it. That's when he decided to appoint Mr. DeKoch. And that's when he made a promise, tell Mr. DeKoch when he's wrong. I said, you're asking me to tell my boss when he's wrong? He says, you did me. Which is probably the best compliment he ever gave me, because I was very honest with him, because for 7 years I'd seen the things that had gone wrong. And I always said I'd tell him everything. And I did. A lot of it he didn't want to hear. But like I said, that wasn't, when he made me his aide, again, I promised him some promises. I turned the job down 3 times, and he finally said, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, you're my aide. So I ended up being that. And I told him, I said, I'm handicapped. He pulls his eye up and was looking at me. I said, no, Mr. Armstrong. I said, I don't control the money, I don't control the time, and I will not lie to you. And he started laughing because he knew what I meant, because people before had told him lies, they had told him partial truths, and all the decisions I saw him make wrong were because people gave him wrong information. And if you have bad information, you make bad decisions. And so I wanted to make sure, in fact, Captain Black told me, Aaron, you're his aide now, you give him the right information, he'll make the right decision. I said, no, Captain, if I give him the right information, he'll make my decision. If I give him all the information, he'll make the right decision. And so that's what I played. I told him everything, straight up, whether it was good or bad, and I had to tell him a lot of things he didn't want to hear. But that was my job, and that's what we all need to do, because we've got to be honest enough to know it. This is a thing I used in a sermon once, where the world has gone now. This is something written by a man outside. He says, first we overlook evil, then we permit evil, then we legalize evil, then we promote evil, then we celebrate evil, and then we persecute those who still call it evil. That's where we are. We are there now. How far is the end of the way? Only God knows. But we're in the exponential part of the curve for the world going downhill. It's all coming together. This is a comic I have there. Again, this is the guy talking to him and say, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. He says those who remember the past are doomed to have to live through those who overlook the past. So that's another thing we're at too, because people don't realize where we're at. And that's a listing of some of the people I had on some of the slides. Anyway, I thought I would share that with you to show you why we thought what we did then. It was a magnificent thing, but it's not things and it's not people, it's God's work and it's God's Spirit and His might and His power that do that for us. And how God looks at down the road all these things we did, He knows what they're doing. He knew what the apostles did. He let them think they'd be alive. They worked hard, and they got killed, and they died. And the same things happened for 2,000 years, and the end is near. There's no question in my mind it's near. How near? God only knows. But we are destroying ourselves rapidly. And the thing I would say of anything is, get your spiritual life in order. Make sure you're ready, because it's going to come as a thief in the night. Overnight, they can change your money. There's a discussion now of our national debt. In Greece, when they had the problem with their money, overnight, your money, they dropped it so that if you had $100,000, you had $43,000 the next day. They just took it. That can happen here, especially if they change to a digital currency, which they're talking about. They've already done trial runs with it, and it could change any time the next few months to a digital currency. At which point in time, they can say, they're already doing it in China, if you have the wrong beliefs, we're going to turn off your bank account. You can't buy anything, can't sell anything. What does Revelation say? No man can buy and sell. I mean, those things are right here in technology. It can happen anytime. So again, get your spiritual lives in order. Have this sense of urgency. Make sure you're ready, because Christ is coming. With that, I'll give you up for the announcements. And do you have any questions or things you want to ask about, or any stories or any things that I'm sure a lot of things that I threw up there would bring on different questions. Again, if you want closure on some things, I have no problem with any question anybody wants to ask. I've answered them all in public forums before. Because again, hearing what happened versus going to the internet and reading stuff that is so off the wall in some cases, and why, you know, it's out there. Satan wants it out there, obviously. But again, Mr. Armstrong's a friend. I don't worship the man. I know he's false better than anyone. But at the same time, he's a piece of history. I like Moses too. He's a piece of history. And all of them pointed, Mr. Armstrong chewed out the church once. They applauded when he got, I'm not here to entertain you. I mean, you know, and then people would say, well, I think, and Mr. I don't want to know what you think. What does God think? And that's where he was. And that's what he would want all of us to be in that same boat. So with that, I will get down and then come back if you want to hear some more things. Well, depending on how hungry you are, this could be the shortest Q&A we've had. Looking at my watch. So nobody written any questions. You'll have all the answers. I tried to answer as many as I could in the show. Make it a little easier. And yes?
I will start it. Back in the early days, you know, in one of the darker times in the church, seemed to go to the receivership.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the receivership, it was interesting because, of course, Ted Armstrong had been put out of the church for some moral issues and things. And one of his people filed a suit because they were hoping to get Ted Armstrong back into the church and various things. There were three groups in that. There was the people outside that wanted to come back in. There was the state of California that wanted to take over churches. And then there were some people in the church that wanted to get rid of Stan Rader, who was a lawyer at the time. All the old-timers would know that. He was someone who tried to take over the church at one point, too. And they were going to get rid of him. They thought, well, Jonestown, the old people remember Jonestown is where the people went down to Guyana and then drank the Kool-Aid and died and all that stuff. So California was using that as a leverage to try to take over churches. And so they filed a suit on the church based on the fact that we were selling the Big Sandy campus for way less than it was worth, and we're going to pocket the money and run off to the Caribbean or something or whatever. And there was no truth or substance to it because we were selling the Big Sandy campus at the time. It was up for sale. We ended up not selling it at that time because of that. But it was interesting. Someone who made an offer on the thing of $10 million. Our appraisal for the property was this thick. Every building, everything that was in it. And basically it said a distressed sale would bring $4 to $6 million, an average sale $6 to $8 million, and a per sale, if someone wanted it as it was, $8 to $10 million. We had an offer of $10 million. And yet in this newspaper article, the guy that made the offer and put down a, I don't know, $50,000, $100,000 earnest money, he was trying to resell it to Liberty Baptist Church and other churches. So he was going around, and in the newspaper, it said, we have this property worth $50 million, and they're selling it, you know, for $10 million, trying to sell it. And it was a newspaper clip, and that long is what they had. The other thing they had in the lawsuit was that the church had bought a dozen golf balls for King Leopold to play golf in Singapore. And therefore, we were misspending money. Oh man, if that's misspending money, then you can put all the senators and congressmen in jail. But it was just that, and they were saying all these things. And because they had people already set up, interesting that the lawyer that they had, when they filed this, they had already gone to a judge, which is illegal, and already had a verdict to get an ex parte. Ex parte means you come in without notice. Normally with legal things, you have to give them notice. You know, you have to read your rights, all these things for criminal, all these things, the statutes. They already had, there were two judges in the Superior Court of California for conservatorship. And the receivership, everybody thinks bankruptcy. Back when the newspaper headlines were receivership, everybody thought that we were going bankrupt. But that wasn't what it was. It was a receivership because they were trying to take over the church itself. And so there's one line, and when you're in line, it's next, you go to that judge, and who's next to this judge. And then if that judge is free first, and you go to that judge. Well, when they got to the front of the line to file the suit, they had the wrong judge. They had to let the person behind them go in front of them to do it. So they knew, and Stan Rader knew this. That's what was funny to me, because one of the things that this lawyer did is he wanted to stay with the church like that. At the same time, he wasn't part of the church. He became part of the church, quote unquote. But there were 2 or 3 times he had written a letter to Mr. Armstrong offering to resign. And every time it happened, there was always something that came up that would make him not resign, that he needed to be there. And in fact, that's how he got baptized. To go with the story, He actually wrote a letter to Mr. Armstrong because some people were attacking him at that time. And again, there's a good reason for some of the attacks. But he wrote a letter to Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong, the world tomorrow is going to be so wonderful, the millennium's wonderful, and the kingdom of God and the feast days. And of course, he had traveled with Mr. Armstrong and heard him talk so many times, he knew what to write. So what he wrote basically is about 6 pages of flattery, with all these wonderful things the church is so great, and the kingdom of God and Christ returning, all stuff like that. And the last paragraph was, but I can't see myself joining a church that has your son with his issues. And he listed the evangelists and their sins because he knew what they were. And so to me, it was flattery, 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 legal clause, I can't join. He's real proud of himself for this letter. And Mr. Armstrong reads it. He looks at him and he says, is this true? What are you going to say? I'm lying to you? Yes. He says, these people have nothing to do with your salvation. If you believe this, you're ready for baptism. Well, do you say I'm lying and kill the goose that lays the golden egg and get fired, or do you get baptized? So he got baptized. Now, I actually supported him for a while because at baptism he changed. Before that, he ate pork, he did different things, even though he's Jewish. Also, I was a crew member, it was a caste system. Mr. Armstrong didn't know this, but I knew it. And if I was in a restaurant and I just started my salad, I had to leave. In the restaurant, I signed the bill and leave. Because I was a lowly crew member and they were passengers. And then all of a sudden he gets baptized and all of a sudden I'm invited to dinner. And again, the rules change. It's kind of like you're playing soccer and you're not allowed to touch the ball, and now you're playing American football and, oh, you get to touch the ball. So the rules changed. So he did a lot of things that made it look like, wow, it was like a Pauline experience. Well, when the receivership came, he used that to call himself back. He actually sent a resignation letter to Mr. Armstrong 3 days before the receivership hit. And the reason I know what happened in line, because he had somebody there to do it. So I knew he knew about it. So he knew when he sent his resignation letter to Mr. Armstrong that this lawsuit was coming. Now, Stan Rader was the #1 student in USC in his year. He was the editor of the law review and the whole thing. And he was also a CPA. So the minute the receivership hit, he called Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong, I understand the state of California is trying to take over your church. I was the #1 law student. If I resigned. I'm sure I'm willing to step back and not take money and all, et cetera. But if you need me, I'll be there. So naturally, he got invited back in. And so there were people trying to get rid of him at the time, and all those things happening. But the receivership, I was there in the receivership, and again, the whole thing tied into Mr. DeKoch as well, because Mr. DeKoch was assigned by Dr. Merritt to be with the widows because they had an ongoing feud. And so he told Mr. DeKoch he wouldn't amount to anything. And when the receivership and the sit-ins happened, they were at a ministers' conference in Tucson. And Dr. Merritt told Mr. DeKoch, well, you stay here and take care of things here, but all the rest of us, you're not that important, so the rest of us are going to Tucson. Well, that's when the sit-ins happened. And in Mr. Rader's book, Against the Gates of Hell, it talks about him joining church service in the hall, which he did, but all the stuff going on was up top. I said at that time in the church, no one who was a local elder, term that time, that would call people and say, hey, come stand up against the state of California. I was calling people and setting it up to come in, and I was doing that because the lawyers were upset because the church wasn't reacting. Well, we're subject to government. Romans says be subject to government. And so they said, look, if you're making it look like to the state, like, hey, everybody doesn't care, get rid of these people. The deputy receiver told me the first day they came in, he says, we're here and we're taking over your church, and next year you'll be keeping Christmas. We're going to change your religion and make it more mainstream. And I'm going, whoa, this is the United States, separation of church and state, how can you do that? But that's what he was doing. They fired Mr. Armstrong, and then Michelle was at the door. She kept him out. That's in the book too. Little Mickey Dean at 5'2" kept the state of California out of the 4th floor offices. And they threatened her with jail, and she said, well, that's okay, I'm not letting you in. So, but you don't go to jail until they prove you're wrong, so she was okay. But the receivership was to take over the church, and they wanted to, and a couple of the board members, or a couple of people from the inside that they thought could help them, weren't board members. Wayne Cole was one of it, and I think Wayne Cole's a good guy. I've talked to him since a number of times, but he wanted to get the church right and do it. And several people tried to do this, but they all wanted to do it like David slaying Goliath. I can be the important person doing this thing. And if your motives are wrong, your actions are wrong. Even if you're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, still wrong. And so that was happening. Well, they came in and took money. They claimed that Mr. Armstrong was overpaid, and they paid themselves more than he was making. They paid him, the deputy receiver. The deputy receiver had a daughter who was a lawyer that they were using, and we didn't have enough lawyers in LA, so she had to fly from her home in San Francisco down here and back every weekend, and we had to pay for hotels and everything. I mean, it was talk about corruption. It was there, so we had to get them out. And the most interesting thing for me with God, here's a miracle from God. We had been trying to sell the Brick at Wood campus in England since 1974 when it closed. Here it is 79. It never sold. It finally sold a couple of months and was closing. It was due to close the day of the receivership. And the money was going to be transferred in. Stan Rader and the gang of lawyers that we had were desperately trying to stop the money from coming in. Their strategy was to stop the money coming in, the receiver goes bankrupt, and then they won't stay there. If you can't get money, why stay? And so that was their strategy. But that strategy would have been bad for the church, because for the church to go bankrupt, and that's what a lot of people thought we were going to bankrupt anyway, the headline receivership over the church. And in fact, the performers at the Ambassador Auditorium that came, Pavarotti and all those guys, they thought we were bankruptcy. They would not perform unless they were paid in cash. So again, I'm the drug lord again. We had to go down and get cash, $30,000, $40,000 in cash to pay these people. And once you'd pay them before the concert, they'd go on stage and perform. That was kind of the deal. Like I said, it's crazy because it wasn't a bankruptcy. But it was interesting because the cash, we couldn't stop it. It came to the receiver. The receiver, instead of putting the money in the bank and saving it, we had a bunch of buildings we had loans on. And the money we had loans on for the buildings was almost the exact amount of the money coming from England. So what he did is he assumed that the tithes were account receivable and the money would keep coming in, so he took the money and paid off all of our buildings. So instead of having all this cash, we had our buildings free and clear. And now, Mr. Armstrong wrote a letter saying, don't send your tithes to Tucson, to a post office box there. And now the receiver is desperate because he has no cash to do anything. But and we weren't bankrupt, and so the church never went bankrupt. So it really looked good for the church to not have a bankruptcy and all these things in the receivership. And so God let it happen and moved the receiver to do what he did. And in 3 months, we had the sit-ins where we sat in the buildings. And my next door neighbor was a policeman in Pasadena, and I'd go home at night and he'd tell me, oh, you won't believe what they told us today. We're going to go down and smash the windows in and do this stuff. And all the cops said, no, we're not doing that. These people are good people. We're not doing that. So I was hearing what was going on from each side. And but the receivership, that was what it was designed for. And that actually brought to light a lot of things that were going on. And again, Mr. Armstrong was able to use that to help straighten out the church and make things work right. And it also, again, a lot of the people that were involved with that tried to get rid of the church, Mr. Armstrong disfellowshipped them because, I mean, you don't call Mr. Armstrong and say, hey, you should let the receiver come in. All they want to do is check our books. That's what, we're pretty ignorant, most of us church members, about what the law is. They just want to check our books and make sure we're running things right, and we don't do anything wrong. Well, if you know anything about the government and them, you don't let them in. President Trump found that out. I mean, they had all sorts of things in the lawsuit there, and we stopped them at the door to not let them in. And finally they got in an hour later. And it was interesting, in the court transcript, and you can read the transcripts, it says, we were met at the door by some young people. It was a stall tactic because they took all the gold and they hid it in the air conditioning ducts and the thing. And by the time we got up there, they had moved it out. Well, how do you prove something that was never there got taken out? I mean, they had some really crazy stuff written in this thing. When the judge finally saw the complaint, saw our things, everything we'd done, went through the stuff, the edict, and you can read this too, he just said this case was wrong. It should never have been filed in the first place. It was done wrong up front, and et cetera, and then they were out at that point. It cost us some money, but at the same time, it straightened out the church and put us back on a keel. So that was what the receivership did. And like I said, the thing from brick and wood and the sale and paying off the building. So when the receiver was out, here we had all the debts paid free and clear. We were on a straight cash basis at that point. We didn't need to borrow money or anything. And why from 74 till it happened that very day? I mean, a lot of things are coincidence. Another thing that's sad for me, because Mr. Picacho was a friend, although I didn't like what he did. When he announced from the pulpit that the Sabbath is done away, you don't have to keep it. And if I'm wrong, God can take me. He died 40 weeks to the day on a Sabbath of saying that. And one of the nurses for Mr. Armstrong was also a nurse. Mr. Picacho had 3 nurses. And they tried to sell his death as a peaceful, happy death, that God gave him a merciful death because he changed all these wonderful doctrines and took us away from the law, the burden of keeping the Sabbath and things. The truth is, the nurses were asked to write that in the book. They told him, we want you to write, he died peacefully asleep, surrounded by his loving family. None of the 3 nurses would write it. All they would write is he died in his sleep. All they'd write is he died with his family around him. That's all they would write. They took the books away from them so that they could advertise what they wanted to say about him. The truth of the matter was, the one nurse told me in 18 years of nursing, he had never seen a more hideous death than Mr. Dukach's. He had cancer in every bone in his body. He could not even roll over in bed without swearing and screaming. He said he did not have cancer before that sermon. And this was like, you read that in the Bible, what happened to Herod and some of the people there. And again, 40 is the number of judgment. And it's scary. I don't want that on my tombstone. And I saw Mr. Koch in August before he died in September, and I could see in his eyes, I said, Mr. Koch, you're dying. I said, you need to go back and listen to Mr. Armstrong's tapes. You said these things, and they're not true. And he said, well, Mike and Joe wouldn't lie to me. I said, wait a minute, did they tell you this? Yes, that was a lie. Did they tell you this? That was a lie. I went through a half a dozen things that they lied about. And part of the things he did is they would tell him, the whole church is agreeing with this, and he'd stay up in the pulpit and then find out that everybody's writing him and say, hey, this is wrong, and he would never change back. In August, before he died, he admitted to me he could not prove a single change he allowed in the church. And I said, you do not have the right to change something unless you can prove it. But again, God was testing us. And when you see those things happen and how God works it, and one of the things when he all the promises, he made a ton of promises to Mr. Armstrong that last, week before he died. And they kept saying that, in fact, you look at on the web, they have a thing from Grace Communion now, which is the old worldwide, that their thing on how it all happened and how God brought them to this new truth and all this stuff, and how we had one apostle who said, keep the Sabbath and all these laws, and we had another apostle that was appointed that said, you don't have to do this. And we had to look in the Bible and see what was right. And I wrote this, because that was said in one of the college blogs from previous graduates, not a church thing. They said that, and they said, you don't know what happened to read Transformed by Truth and that. And I wrote on there, I said, no, the book should have been transformed by lies. They lied about everything. I said, show the document, because the document Mr. Armstrong's side that the legal office wrote up is fairly long, and it said, I'm hereby appointing Mr. Dukach. He's going to be president, chairman, all my titles. Mr. Armstrong would not sign it. I had to put a little mark in there and above it write, except that of apostle. He said, I cannot give the spiritual title. God has not told me. If you keep the Sabbath, if you keep the holy days, if you hold fast the truth, God will give it to you. I can't. I said, show the document. He was never made an apostle. He didn't keep the truth. He didn't hold fast. And I said, everything you said was lies. And I went through all the different, I said, I'm not going to do the he said, she said. I'll tell you the things that actually happened. Show the documents. This is what they are. I know what they said, because I read them and wrote them, some of them. And I said, he said Mr. Armstrong wanted to apologize to Dr. Stavronidis, who was Greek, who did the thing on the Trinity for them, the hypostasis and all that. I said, Mr. Koch, in the intro to his film, which was sent to all the ministers, these tapes of that. And he said, Mr. Armstrong wanted me to apologize to him for terminating him and that people came and did him in. And I called Mr. Koch and I said, he was not done in. I said, you know that. This is a lie. I said, Dr. Stavronidis has a lot of people left the church because of him, because he was teaching things in his Greek class and stuff that said the Bible really wasn't true and it wasn't 3 days a night, a lot of things. And Mr. Armstrong, and he had a different thing on born again, etc. But I said, Mr. Armstrong did not do him in. What happened is one of the students taped his classes. He brought the tapes. Mr. McNair was over the college, brought it up, started to talk to Mr. Armstrong. I said, Mr. McNair, don't talk. I said, we took the tapes, put them in the tape recorder, we played them to Mr. Armstrong. He listened to about 2 or 3 hours of this class. He said, that man does not have God's Spirit. He'll teach over my dead body. And he was removed from the college. And said, you're saying that Mr. Armstrong apologized to him. I said, okay, go up to the house and ask the people that worked at Mr. Armstrong's house, because his heart doctor came out one day and says, who's this Stradivarius guy? And that was Mr. Armstrong. He joked about that. And I said, Stavronidis. And he said, he ordered the staff, don't mention his name in this house. When you do, that man has a heart attack. And this is a month before he dies. And you're there, you heard that, and now you're saying that you just remember something else Mr. Armstrong told you, that you're supposed to apologize to him. I said, if you're being done in by playing your tapes, tape me and play them back and do me in. Nobody came, nobody did him in. That was wrong. You're trying to support your position on the Sabbath. Another thing in Texas, he said, Mr. Armstrong, I should tell you about these formal dinners Mr. Armstrong had. Every Friday night he had a formal dinner for the students. I said, Mr. Dukach, he never had a formal dinner on a Friday night because that was the Sabbath. And I said, even if I wanted to lie for you, I said, you have hundreds of students, none of them ever went on a Friday night. The people who made the dinner list were the student body officers and the class presidents, and they were told you can only do it Sunday through Thursday. So you have hundreds of people, you have a dozen people who actually made the list, and you have hundreds of people who went who never went on Sabbath, and yet you tell the whole forum that Mr. Armstrong had these dinners on Friday night. That was a lie. And I mean, every time he did one, I did it. And these are things black and white you can prove. It wasn't the he said, she said stuff where you can't prove. And I put that all in that forum. And what was funny to me is how many of the people that don't go to church anymore that agreed with me. In fact, a couple of them have been ministers and quit church altogether. And they wrote and said they were treated by the Tecachas worse than anybody's ever treated them in their lives, which I thought was kind of funny. They wrote me privately, some of them. And one of the people on the inside that left Mr. Tecach wrote me and said, yeah, exactly what you said was exactly what happened, the whole thing. So they wouldn't, Mike and Joe are on that forum, and they wouldn't say anything, obviously, because they know what I'm saying is the truth. And they admit it. So again, those things happen. But again, go read about the Kings and Chronicles. Read about Queen Athaliah, who kills all the king's children, tries to be in charge, and Simon Magus, who offers money so I can give the Spirit. I want to get in front of this parade. I want to heal people and have 5,000 people come and follow me. So I mean, that's always been the case of people. And the people aren't necessarily bad people. I don't think a lot of them just probably never had the Spirit of God to start with. And they crept in unawares. And so that happened. And I, everybody asked him, so why did he appoint Mr. Tecach for this? Somebody else wouldn't have changed the doctrines. But again, how would we have all been tested if he hadn't done that? And so all these little pieces along the way, I look at the receivership, and the fact that Tecach was left there because he was so low, it's what brought him into the picture to be put on ministerial services, to be in a position to be put in charge of the church. But only the physical positions. Mr. Tecach asked to be ordained to the job at least a dozen times. Every time he's like, no, I cannot. God can do it if you hold fast, if you do it. He took the title of apostle within 2 months of Mr. Armstrong's death. I challenged him on that because the Pastoral Jones report came out and it said the man who Mr. Tecach appointed in his old job turns around and says, oh, he's an apostle. And I said, you want to be an apostle because the man who you put in your old job scratches your back and now he says you're an apostle? He said, you know what Mr. Armstrong said? And well, I have to be over these men. He started yelling at me and the veins are coming out. I finally said, wait a minute, wasn't Peter one of 12 apostles? There wasn't a super apostle. I said, so he called Dr. Hay. Dr. Hay agreed with me. It was interesting, though, because the next day I was up on the executive office floor, which is the top floor, fourth floor of the Hall of Administration. And I walk in there, and the PGR had come out, and Dr. Meredith and Ray McNair are reading it, two evangelists. And they said, that article's not in here. I said, well, yeah, I know that. I said, did you agree with the article? Oh, no, absolutely not. I said, did you say anything? Oh, no, we didn't say anything. I said, I did. They started laughing. I said, what are you laughing at? Well, now we know why you were removed from the Council of Elders this morning. Yes, question, Reggie.
Sandy wanted to ask this question. I saw her hand going up.
Okay, go for it.
Mr. Rader's book, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
So would you say it's pretty much heresy and lies?
The appendix with all the transcripts are perfect. Michelle's part was true. Tecach's part was kind of true. He did lead the services downstairs because we needed a minister to do that while we were upstairs doing the phone calls. I called all the people and had them come to the thing. And they all asked me, does Mr. Armstrong know about this? Again, nobody nobody in the back of the room could say, hey, come stand up against the government. Nobody would do it. It had to be from the pulpit. And the thing is, they knew I worked for Mr. Armstrong, and so I would tell them he will. Because the lawyer said it has to be grassroots. Lastly, the people just rose up on their own. Why? Because Mr. Armstrong said, get over there and do this. I mean, that's not grassroots. So what happened at 10 o'clock, I called Mr. Armstrong and said, Mr. Armstrong, I got 5,000 people coming to take the buildings tomorrow. If I'm wrong, I'll call them back and have them stay home. He said, well, it's God's property. Let them protect it. So that's what happened. Yes, Reggie.
During the time of 1820 and everything, and when the Pilgrims came over,
Yes.
as far as church history goes, was there, the Sabbath keepers versus Sunday keepers?
Yes.
Was that just a period of time when the Church of England was in control?
Yeah, the Church of England was forcing people out, and most people went to Holland and then they left from Holland to come over here. And there were a lot of Sabbath-keeping Baptists as such. And some of those, we look at a group, we kind of pull them together. We have Peter Waldo back in the 1500s, 1600s, and we think that, and I believe in church eras, I really do, because Revelation starts with, these are the things so you'll know what will come to pass. Now, yes, there were the 7 churches on the mail route, but there's enough history to me to show that those things did happen. With the third one where it says that you'll have, the hour of trial in 10 days of tribulation. There was one, right about that time, there was 10 years of tribulation were really bad. And there's things you can trace. The first 3 eras, it says, it doesn't say endure to the end. The last 4, it says endure till I come. Personally, my speculation is that the people over in Carpathia and that area, the Ukrainian Sabbath keepers that do it, I think that's part of the Thyatira of the church. And I think what we call the Sardis there, the church of God's seventh day, they have the Sabbath and stuff. And I had a lot of talk to the president. Locally, the church keeps 75% of the income, the local church. And you can have some really good potlucks with 75% of your income. And 15% goes to the region that they're in, and only 10% comes to the Bible Advocate and some of those things. So they never really had the funds to do a work per se in that sense. Plus, they're very regionally independent. They're trying to put a structure, but I asked myself, what's going to happen to the people that have total independence, a lot of money, when they decide they don't agree with you? Is it going to cause division and stuff? And he said, well, we're concerned about it. We're not sure what's going to happen. And we don't even know if we'll get it put together. So that thing, but the Sabbath keepers, I think that's where the Church of God Seventh Day, Sardis, what we'd call Sardis, was starting at that time, and the Ellen G. White, and then the split there, and then the various things. And then Mr. Armstrong comes in contact with them, and they had the Sabbath. They're good people as such, but then the holy days, although right now 4 of their elders do keep the holy days. And 10 years ago, they wrote a document saying you're allowed to keep them if you want to, but you don't have to, and you can't teach it. So that those elders and some of their members actually go to our feast sites. They like us. And and the reason I went to the conference, Rick Shaby told me go ahead and go and do this. And I went with Vic Kubik. And Vic had talked to him in 95, 96 and things. And we were talking to them about the Sabbath back when they changed it as such. And so there were some things in common we had with that. And the Sabbath is good. And the holy days, they just never did that. But if some of their people now start seeing it and they're asking, and I'm meeting in France in September, I'm meeting some of those people. And so we're not trying to poach people from them, but if people want to come to the feast, they're welcome to come to our site. And how God looks at those people that are keeping the feast and keeping the Sabbath, even though it's not with us. And, and if they come and keep, that's fine. But God's the one that knows who the spiritual body is, not us. But it's fascinating to me to see how those things come about. And it was interesting. I met a guy who was 98, going to be 99 this week. He's already 99 now. He was back in the church up in Eugene. Was a young man, and he had joined the military as a medic. He wouldn't carry a gun, kind of like Hacksaw Ridge thing. And Mr. Armstrong wrote him a letter every month to encourage him. And so he wanted to meet me, so I worked with Mr. Armstrong. It's kind of interesting to meet a guy 99 years old that got letters from Mr. Armstrong when he was in the service to encourage him. So, but like I said, things like that happen, it's like I said, God works these things out and makes that. Mr. Armstrong asked me, is everything set up? And I'd say yes, and I had no idea. I was just going on faith, basically. I just said, if God wants you to see him, you see him. If you don't, you don't. And like I said, his last trip, 9 countries in 24 days, wow. At 92 years old, when you can't see, can't hear. I mean, only God. In Nepal's the altitude, there's 4,500, 5,000 feet, and he had problems with the oxygen at that time. I think this was about 84. And the man who was hosting us, General Rana, his wife asked Mr. Armstrong to lunch, and he went. Usually he doesn't. He went there. We had lunch. And during lunch, he started having some heart pains, took nitro and oxygen and stuff like that. And Mrs. Rana saying, hey, he can't speak tonight to the Parliament. We need to call and cancel. I said, no, don't cancel it. Oh, no, we have to cancel. He's not strong enough for this. And I said, no, don't. So we leave the lunch. We go back to the hotel. He rests like that. On the way down there, he's walking down the hall. He takes oxygen in the hallway, and some of the people in the room could see down the hallway. Stops and takes oxygen for a little bit, comes back in, and he goes and sits at the head table. I sit with General Rana and his wife. She looks at, you're killing him. You can't do this to him. He can't. I said, just hold on. So he kind of plays with his food a little bit for the dinner, and he gets the mic put in front of him. And he gets in front of the mic, starts pounding away, the kingdom of God's coming. I mean, he just laid out. And 10 minutes into it, Mrs. Rana says, that's not him talking, that's God talking. That man's not that strong. And things like that would happen. And, God just gave him the strength when he needed it in these things. And the reason he changed to the G3, some people thought, well, he just, I get a new car and do this and like that. No, he didn't care about that. The problem was the G2 was the best jet of its time, and when he went and flew and met with leaders and carried them, it was wonderful. But the problem is the cabin was 8,500 feet. That's as low as you get it when you're flying at 42,000 feet altitude. Well, it was fine, but with his heart attack and the blood count was low, he had to take oxygen when we were flying. So the G3, when we went to that, the cabin pressure, you keep it at 4,000 feet. There's a lot more air at 4,000 feet than there was at 8,500 feet in the cabin. And so that's why you updated the plane, was so we could do that. I mean, it added 4 hours to our range too, so we could cross oceans and things a lot easier. But it wasn't about the things as such. Even everything in his house, he said, if the church ever needs money, we'll sell this. He sold the only 2 houses he ever owned, he sold and gave the money to the church. He didn't own anything. He left everything in his will to the church. And so there isn't, like I said, those things that happen, they can't. But all those events that I witnessed, like I said, for me to go against this stuff, I'm going against God because I saw too many miracles that happen. And too many visits. I had the State Department ask, how do you do this? And they said, well, how far ahead do you plan your meetings? Because we plan a year and a half ahead. I said, well, we plan a month ahead. I said, I planned some of our visits while we're on the trip. And we flew over Syria one day. The day before, they forced a private jet down because it had a permit. We got our permit while we were in the air flying over Syria. And thankfully, they didn't shoot us down. And we're the only plane to fly from Jerusalem to Cairo and Cairo to Jerusalem. We actually flew down. We had to file. You weren't allowed because of South African apartheid to fly to South Africa. So we always filed to one of the other countries and then change our flight in the air. We flew after when Israel owned the Sinai after the war and then gave it back to Egypt. During that time, we flew down the Red Sea with MiGs on one side and Phantoms on the other side. The Israeli jets and the Egyptian jets. It's kind of fun. You can look out and wave at them on both sides. But but you're sitting there thinking, okay, I never worried about it. I figured there are angels on the wings. It's not a problem. But so, just amazing the visits we had, the things that came up. And, and like I said, some of the meetings, I had to do some things that are kind of funny. Because in Thailand, Stan Rader had paid for called meetings there. The funny thing I found is that when they met Mr. Armstrong, they realized he didn't know some of the things Stan Rader had done. And they liked him, and so he got to come back. And Mr. Armstrong thought that Stan Rader had set the meetings up so well, that's why he got to go. And actually, it was him protecting and helping himself in that sense. And that's why I told Mr. Armstrong, I saw all these things that happened because he really upset. And when I got to Thailand, some people asked for money. I said, we don't do that. Mr. Armstrong didn't know about it. Stan Rader did that. Go ask him for money because he was already out by that time. And so I said, I won't pay for meetings, but I asked God, how do I set up some of these meetings now? And it was funny because the Pratep, which is like a cardinal in the Catholic Church, the Pratep for Thailand, he was sent to Van Nuys, which is the largest Thai community outside of Thailand. And they had a big Buddhist temple there. And some of our students had gone over and helped do some work that had gone to Thailand for projects. And he liked him so much, he wanted to meet Mr. Armstrong. So he meets Mr. Armstrong. And Mr. Armstrong tells him that, well, I had a message from Princess Lillian to give to Queen Sirikit, and I haven't been able to see her all these visits I've gone like that. And Pratep says, I'm the Queen's favorite Pratep. I'll set up the meeting for you. So I got this orange-sheeted, bald-headed monk offering to set up a trip. And I got all sorts of flack from that. And I said, look, hey, if a Protestant or a Catholic does it, they're pagan too. So what's the difference between a Buddhist who shaved pagan and a other pagan? I said, if God sends, I'm not going to shoot Balaam's ass either. If God talks to the donkey, I'm going to use it. And so I got a lot of flack for this. But the thing is he was great. He got us there. He got us the presidential suite in the Montana Hotel. It's $1,000 a night. We get it for $300 a night. And he met the Queen for the first time there after having been to Thailand so many times meeting the King. And Mr. Armstrong always wondered why he'd always ask the King, where's the Queen? And the King would always kind of back off. Well, protocol there is that you only meet heads of state or royalty if king to king, king to president. If it's a king and queen, then president, first lady, et cetera. I mean, too, since Mr. Armstrong was alone, not married at the time, he never met the Queen and he was never there. And so I finally learned that protocol. So this time he asked to meet the Queen. Well, the Queen met and the King came along. And then the Crown Prince came as a king now. And they violated protocol to let him meet all of them at one time, which is fascinating to me. And it's funny because the Crown Prince asked me to, he was in the Air Force. He asked me, hey, do you want to fly around the country in an F-16? I'd love to, but I didn't get to. But anyway, So I got to know him a bit. But again, we're the same age, obviously, so it's a lot in common. But again, there's so many things like that just opened up and happened that were definition of protocol. And in fact, the Seventh Day guy said, well, how did Mr. Armstrong meet all these leaders? And I said, well, God set it up like that. And I said, the State Department asked me that. And they said, we plan our trips a year and a half in advance, and if anything, we cut them short and come home. And I said, well, ours always get extended when we go. All my 3-week trips end up being 6, except when I set them up, I didn't do that because I want to get the crew back. But I said, yeah, Rex Humbard asked us in Jordan, how do you get to meet the king? And I said, well, you got to work for the right God. And he laughed. I said, well, Rex Humbard didn't laugh. But anyway, yeah.
This COVID in 2019, are some projects that are simply going to come up to be done? Mr. Slaby mentioned about Bangladesh and everything. And
Well, the people in Bangladesh, there's a couple members came in kind of by themselves and got a hold of David Schreiber, who's over India, Sri Lanka, and that. And to come to the church, you had to have a church and register. You have to have a property and a place to meet. Well, we had a place we could rent like that. This man was willing to give his little garden plot to be a church property like that. But there was another thing you had. If you die, you have to be buried in a cemetery, and you have to own a cemetery. So the cemetery came for sale out there at the same time. It was about $6,000 or $8,000. So that happened. He managed to go down there and get registered in one day. I mean, the whole thing was just a series of miracles. Again, so they still happen in places. It's not kind of like Africa. Cameroon, we been trying to get registered there for about 24 years. And about 20 years ago, we paid them $5,000 to rush the process. And we still haven't gotten registered. But and if the president dies, let's start over. I mean, you never really know what's going to happen. But we're able to meet there and do things, so it's not a major problem, where it would have been in Bangladesh a little more difficult. So God knows what, where, when, and how. And it's this, yes?
I had one more question.
Sure.
I'm gonna wrap this up. What was Mr. Armstrong's general demeanor or his thoughts, if he expressed them to us, when he knew that he was going to die? And
Yeah.
did he feel like there was a dark cloud looming?
Well, he knew there was going to be a falling away and knew things were going to happen that way, but he wasn't, I mean, God's in charge of the church. He knew that. At the same time, he told me, he said, God's timing is different. I thought I'd be here till the end. Obviously, I'm not now. You know.
Did he have a sense of things were really going to start coming unraveled?
He knew they were. He didn't know how. He just said, I know prophecy says it's going to happen. And how it's going to happen, he didn't know. And he wasn't worried, although the last letter that he wrote, which he didn't write, I wrote it. But I wrote in his style because I'd written so many things with him. I wrote his book with him and stuff. I brought it with one, he autographed for me. And because he said, well, the work's finished. Purification of the bride's next. And I said, Mr. Armstrong, we're supposed to write a letter. Good luck, everybody. I finished my work. Good luck to you. I said, that's not really what they need to hear. So I wrote the letter for him. And I told Mr. Gotch there too. And I said, this doesn't go out unless I know he understands it. Because he was so weak. He could only say a few words. And he sat in his chair and kind of hunched over. And I sat on the floor, looked up in his eyes, and I said, Mr. Armstrong, you'd fire people for writing for you, I know that. But I said, this has to go out, and it needs to be from you. And if you don't understand it and can't signal that you do, then I won't let it go out. So I read it to him. In one spot, the thing I talked about this present world, he said, this present evil world. And then he squeezed my hand. So I knew he understood the whole thing. And so that got sent out. But I wrote the whole letter for him. And but he knew that was coming, and he didn't know how or what, but he knew God was going to do something. And like I said, it was just an unusual, none of us knew what was going on. And like I said, we all thought that Christ was going to come, and we still thought that, but then all of a sudden everything started changing, complacency set in, and they sold all the properties. God just took it all away from them. They disintegrated in no time at all. But, it's hard to really know. None of us, there's always God's way of doing things, which is out of left field sometimes. And we can speculate all we want. And it says no man will know the day or the hour. Well, if you did a lottery and everybody took a day with 8 billion people, somebody would know. But it'd just be by guessing, not because they knew anything. So we don't. But at the same time, he does say, watch the clouds. He says, yeah, you see the east and you know it's going to rain. You see this and you see that. And it says, watch and pray. And why? Unless it's not. Plus, it says no man knows the day or the hour. And what's fascinating to me is Christ returns on trumpets. The only feast you don't know the day or the hour is trumpets. All the rest of them are full moons. Trumpet's the new moon. And a new moon, you don't know until you get that little piece of a moon. And it's interesting, all the people that are against the calendar who say postponements are wrong, about 4 or 5 years ago, those people all had a postponement because the new moon appeared before sunset. And how do you backtrack holy time? So they had to postpone it till the next day. Only choice you could have to have a 24-hour holy day. And so, but it's interesting, it says no one knows the day of the hour. Does that mean maybe we won't figure out for the year it's coming? And obviously when the tribulation starts, the two witnesses, you got 3.5 years. So we will know at that point what's going on. So it's anyway, curious to see how some of these prophecies that we tend to try to interpret through the lenses we want to see through. But we're getting close, and you don't stop doing what it is, and the work will go on as long as any of us have breath to be doing the work. And that's the key. I said, Mr. Armstrong, where in the Bible does it say that the work ends because you die? I said, we got to have something more than that to encourage us to go on. And we have gone on. 35, 36 years now. We've gone on since then. And he'd be the first to admit that the prophecies are right, the way we had it numbered were wrong. And that's something that you understand that all of us, again, I have no problem with speculation, but I don't stand up here and say, well, it's going to happen this way, and this is exactly what this means. And I can read the scripture and say that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, here's how I think it might happen. That's speculation. And God has other ways to do it. I would have never purified the church by putting an apostate person in charge. I would have never purified by having the state of California come in and take over the church. I would never, and the apostles the disciples didn't think Christ was really going to get crucified. And they, we're going to go fishing afterwards. And he comes back and all these things that God does for each of us. And I think he works in your life individually a lot more than we think he does. And I can't prove things aren't time and chance, but when all the dominoes line up in the same direction, you can kind of think, okay, that kind of, so like Mr. Koch dying 40 weeks of the day. Yeah, can that be coincidence? Yeah, but to not have cancer and to get cancer all through your whole body and die at that time, that's scary. And those type of things that only God can control. And what he has left to do and who the two witnesses are and when they show up. And people say that we have the wrong government, that we have God's government, these other groups. And I believe God's government is hierarchical with God and Christ, etc. Because Christ didn't tell the two sons, the brothers, that about the right, when they said, can I be on your right and left? He didn't say there is no right and left. He said, I can't do that. My Father tells us who that is. But I said, if you want to say that you can only be right if you have God's form of government, and there is government in the church, but we've got 100 splinters out there. They're all of hierarchy. Which one of them is God's government? Well, Satan has God's government too. Why don't you follow him? It's only God's government if God puts the people there. And that's the key. And so I said, if God makes it very clear, Mr. Armstrong, the willingness to give up all the money and give up all the things, go through poverty, do all this stuff, to be revealed, all the knowledge that all the splinter groups have with the holy days and all those things, had to come from God. And so we all recognize that. And he's the one that gets attacked all the time out there, get accused of all sorts of foul things. And I worked for him 12 years, never heard any things like that. There's things about incest, there's things about all sorts of stuff. And I've answered those questions. I had young people ask me the questions because that's one of the fears. You look up on the internet, you'll see these things, which is funny because one kid who read all the trash said, man, this guy's getting trashed. He's been dead for 20-some years. And he said, what did he write? So he read his books and came into the church. So, God can even use trash to bring people in. But the thing is, I sit there and I say, I flew with him 12 years. This one man who supposedly at the Mount Pocono at the feast site did a half-an-hour walk. Mr. Armstrong told him all this stuff, and he writes it up in this book. And I worked for him 12 years and never hear a thing. I was in the house, and his daughter was asking for money, and the one that supposedly it happened with, and they didn't know I was in the house. She was screaming at him, and she never said, you know what, I was in a situation where it could have come up and never did. So do I believe it? No, but if it happened, hey, you can repent of sin anyway. But the funny thing is all these things out there that people say. Mr. Armstrong did like Prince Charles. I was talking to Prince Charles once, and they had one of the rags was there saying a bunch of stuff about, because he's meeting Mr. Armstrong stuff. And I said, yeah, we ought to sue him for that. I could see the prince kind of bristle. And I said, yeah, of course you don't, because all you do, because I knew what their policy was. Their policy is if anything happens, you ignore it. Because if you answer it, he said this. What is your rebuttal? And what's your rebuttal? Oh, and this. And it never ends. So the policy is just they say it once, it's there, it's a headline, and you never talk about it because then there's nothing to go back and ask, this is how they responded, so this is how do you respond? How do you respond? So that was his policy. Mr. Armstrong, he told me, he says, don't ever answer those things. It's just a waste of time. They're going to believe what they're going to believe and leave it alone. And so there's things out there that, like I said, I'm not afraid to answer the questions that people have. And because it's irrelevant, if that's the case, like I said, David shouldn't be in the kingdom either, if something did happen. But to me, the 12 years I flew with him, I never saw any of that. And Ron Dart, when he talked to me after he started his own work and had me come down and talk to him, and he said, Mr. Armstrong lied about things. I said, well, I can point to the articles that he said, I approved this, and later on I never approved it. And the reason was what he approved was not the product they gave him. He should have said, I approved something, but it's not what they gave me. It would have been more accurate. But he said, I never approved that STP. And yet there's writings that he had where I approved the STP, which was a systematic theology project. And they were supposed to take all of his writings and put them in subject matter, baptism, doctrines, and whatever. And what they gave him was everybody else's stuff. And he got mad and said, I never approved this. So it looks like a lie, but it wasn't. And a lot of things like that happened to him where he was given information, he'd write things. In fact, Stan Rader told him he was hosting one of the events in England with the Queen. The Queen doesn't host with anybody. Thankfully, Frank Brown knew that was not true, took it out of the letter. But everybody in America got this, and it was wrong. But that's what he was told. And he believed people, and that was one of his biggest weaknesses. He believed people that lied to him. And so there were things like that. And I said, Ron Dart said, and he wanted to spend all that money and the things. And I said, it wasn't him. Oh, yes, it was. I said, no. I said, you left in 76. I said, I took over all the budgets in 80, late 80, early 81. I said, the travel days at that time were $15,000 to $20,000 for travel day. When I took it over in the 80s, it was $3,000 to $5,000 for travel day. Now, if a lawyer CPA couldn't tell him you can't spend this money, and he wouldn't listen to him, how did a theology kid at 27 years old say you can't do this, and he did it? Who's lying? And so, and the thing is, and I just took away the waste, and Mr. Armstrong, when I did projects, he said, well, if you can find the money, and I always found the money in his budget, because I started asking the government to give us cars. Before, we'd always rent cars, limos, whatever. I said, look, we're here to help your country. Can you give us cars? And most of them would, so I had free cars. Hotel, I'd take the magazine, the articles, like some of these in newspapers where Mr. Armstrong's here meeting King Bhumipal or King whoever it was, and he's staying at the Hilton Hotel or the whatever hotel it was. I'd say, this is free advertising for you. I'm not paying full price for the presidential suite. We'll move to another hotel. I'd get presidential suites for half price stuff. And that's how I got the money to start the Sri Lankan project and all these other projects is out of his budget. But the thing is these things, God helps you do things. But again, you use the talent you have as well at the same time. And the thing about it is, when he had his heart attack, I actually did law and accounting classes at that time, which I didn't want to do. But I was told Mr. Armstrong wanted me to, which later I found out he didn't know anything about it, and I got fired for it. But it was, but actually I used all that stuff anyway. And so it's one of those things where God knows what's coming and what you need. Anyway, I could go on forever, but I don't want to. You're getting hungry. Question, go ahead.
What was his favorite scripture?
His favorite scripture? Oh, he had so many. His mother's favorite one was the Psalms, brethren dwelling together in unity. He never talked about a favorite scripture per se. I mean, he'd read them all so much, he'd quote a lot of them. But I couldn't say a favorite scripture. I mean, the whole thing was one of his favorite sayings. Was, I've read to the end of the book, and the end is we win, which is a good thing. That's true. But before we win, you get beat up a lot. I can tell you that. And so, but now I'm trying to think of favorite scripture. I'm not sure he had a favorite scripture per se. But it was fun to be with. I always teased him. One thing is, everybody looked down the figurehead, and he didn't like that. He liked to be with people. Two things he told me. I love reading the Bible. I can't because I can't see. I love meeting people, and I can't because I'm too weak. So I set up a feast site in 83 or in Big Sandy. I asked for a printout. How many people are there that have been in the church for 20 years, 25, 30? I figured he handled about 200 to 300 people. So I set it up, and it was supposed to be an hour of tea. He stayed there for over 4 hours talking to those people. He loved it. But he said, I just can't shake hands with 1,000 people. And reading the Bible, one of the things he did to me at the end when we were in the house the last 6 months when he couldn't go out at all, he asked me I need to know Christ said something to somebody about something. I said, could you be a little more specific? Well, I'm not sure. He said, I'll tell you, just start reading the Gospels. We'll see. I'll know it when I hear it. So I read all of Matthew, all of Mark, all of Luke, all of John. Maybe it was the Apostle Paul. So I read the whole New Testament to him. And I think he just wanted to hear the whole Bible read. But he didn't want to ask me to do it. I mean, he was fun to be with. And I would tease him. The circus, the dog with the leash with no dog that they have on there. I brought one on the plane once, and I went up there and rubbed his leg, and he kind of looks and takes his good eye, looks down there, looks at me. I hope your dog's well behaved. I mean, I would do things with him, because to me, it was a person. We were friends as such. And he'd always say, your wife, she's like my granddaughter, but you and I are colleagues. Of course, he was 60 years older than I was. And I told him when he turned 80, I said, hey, he turned 90. I was turning 30 that year. I said, I'm catching up with you. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, 10 years ago, I was 20, you were 80. I was a quarter your age. You're 90, I'm 30, I'm a third your age. I'm gaining. Well, by the resurrection, I may have caught up. But I treated him like a person, and that's what he needed. He needed real people around him, and he'd like that. He had a ministry meeting once where he asked for a glass of wine. I said, no, Mr. Armstrong, you can't have it. All the ministry. and he looks at me, he looks back at them, he's a real taskmaster. But he had his heart problem then, and he wasn't supposed to have it, so I told him. But I mean, I was very real with him, and that's what he needed. He was a very real person. But so many people put him on a pedestal that it was real hard for him to do some things. But like I said, he was a class person in the sense he wanted to make sure, even at the meetings. Now, who should be there? Just me and him? I said, Mr. Armstrong, you can't hear us stuff. And we learned little games. In Thailand with the king, to show honor to old people, you talk low. Well, old people can't hear. So, which doesn't make any sense, but we're meeting with the king, and the king asked a question. I realized Mr. Armstrong didn't hear him, and so I just stopped and looked at the king and said, Your Majesty, Mr. Armstrong. And basically what I did was I kind of repeated the question in my answer, short answer, and then I looked at Mr. Armstrong, and he said, yeah, and then Mr. Armstrong started going on. And we started playing that password type game a lot because he could hear me and understand me, but he couldn't understand them at times, but we'd do that. And I didn't think anything of it. But the king and queen of Thailand, especially, and others did too, noticed it because I got some letters from him. In fact, I got one, she talked to me and she said, I wish you could come teach our staff. We noticed when you were there that you always made him look good. That when it came time to get up to a door, instead of just waiting until you got there, let me help you, Mr. Armstrong, with the door, you'd get far enough ahead to open it like an honor guard, opening the door for someone important. And when you didn't understand something, you would say something, but you'd always back away. And they noticed that. Which I guess if you're royalty, you've been around that your whole life, you do notice things like that. But people that play up or do things. But my job is to make him look good. All of our job is to make each other look good. And not only look good, but be good. And that's the one thing I tried to do for him, was to make him the most effective as it could be. And like I said, most of those pictures that are printed, I'm not in almost any of them, except a couple with the Queen. For one, I was taking pictures. Mr. Armstrong asked me once, how come you're not in these pictures? And I said, Mr. Armstrong, I showed him the booklet, and I said, see the picture between you and Judge Singh of the World Court? I said, that's Stan Rader. He looks, he's not there. I said, yeah, we airbrushed him out. It costs $500 to airbrush somebody out of the picture. I said, I'm not going to spend widow's money airbrushing me out of a picture. I said, I'm in some of these pictures. See this picture here? I'm here. See this picture here? I'm here. And photography and TV loved me. They said, wow, you're great to work with. I always knew where the cameras were. I always knew it was. I always kept my elbows and knees in, so you didn't have these hanging things. Before me, the people that flew that wanted a position, they had to get between them, you know. And Larry Masters, our TV, said it's like they kind of be wearing the same shirt because they wanted to be in the picture. And so all these pictures, they airbrush people out of. And I said, Mr. Armstrong, if something goes wrong with me, I don't want to have to be airbrushed out. And so, and plus, I said, I can get so much more done when people don't know who I am. I can walk through a crowd and nobody knows who I am. I can walk through it. If they know who you are, everybody stops you. And so, plus all the things that they're talking about, they tell you because they don't know who you are. And they feel real guilty afterwards. But I got stopped by a deacon in Tucson once. You can't go in there. Mr. Armstrong's in there. I said, well, I need to see Mr. Armstrong. No, you can't go in there. And I said, well, he said, who are you? I said, I'm Aaron Dean. Oh, I'm sorry. I said, no, you're doing your job. That's what you're supposed to. In fact, I spoke at that feast, and a lady came in late and sat down next to me with her couple of kids. She said, oh, I want to hear Aaron Dean speak. And she didn't know I was Aaron Dean. When they announced me, I got up. She almost fainted. But that was good for me. I could do things. You know, you don't have to be important. You know, it's better to be, Mr. Armstrong, I said, it's better under the table. When the mud's flying, you don't get hit. So that was it. But again, that's our job, is to try to help everybody get in the kingdom. And again, you have a late potluck here, so no more questions. You can talk and ask questions anytime you want. I get emails, I answer emails, I do a lot of stuff. So, but I think it's interesting to know we're all people. We're all trying to do the same thing. The apostles were all people. The prophets were all people. Moses was all these people are people, and they're wonderful people, and they all made mistakes. And so mistakes don't keep you out of the kingdom. It's lack of repentance keeps you out of the kingdom. So again, I enjoyed being with you. I hope you understand a little more of the history of the work there. And if anything ever comes up that you want to have a question about, I get a lot of ministers. I've told them, just if you have people ask questions about different groups and things and the past, send them to me. I'll answer them because they can't. They weren't there in the room. I was. And so that's a big difference. So anyway, with that, I guess we'll have a closing hymn or whatever. How do you want to end this thing? Yes, that's the way we're going to end it. Good. So that's your sermon for today.